Hey you. Yes, you, the one who just got into bed, maybe pulled the blanket up a little tighter, maybe let out that long breath you've been holding all day. Welcome. I am really glad you're here. Tonight we're going somewhere a little unexpected. Not a battlefield, not a royal court, not the ruins of some ancient civilization. Tonight we're going somewhere quieter, and in a strange way far more personal. We're going to a bathroom vanity. Circa 1953. Imagine a woman standing in front of a small oval mirror, the kind with a little chrome frame. The light above her is warm. There is a glass shelf holding maybe 6 or 7 small jars and bottles, each one lined up with quiet precision. The bedroom behind her is still. The house is still. And she is doing something that almost no one today does anymore. She is taking her time, not rushing through a 12-step routine she saw on social media at 2 a.m, not speed-running a face wash because she's already 15 minutes late. She's standing at that mirror, deliberate and unhurried, doing things that women passed down from mother to daughter. Things treated not as a chore but as a ceremony. And here is the part that might genuinely surprise you: some of these things actually worked. Quietly. Steadily, in ways that modern science is only now catching up to explain. But before we go any further, if you're finding your way here for the first time, or maybe you've been with me for a while and just never got around to it, it would honestly mean a lot if you took one small moment. Hit that like button, share this with someone who loves a good bedtime story, or drop a comment and tell me where in the world are you watching from right now. Are the lights already low? Is there a fan humming somewhere nearby? I love knowing. It reminds me that someone out there is actually listening, and that makes all of this worth it. Soft light, slow breath, let us go. To really understand what beauty meant to a woman in 1953, you have to understand the world she was standing in. The war had ended 8 years earlier, and in those 8 years, America had transformed at a speed that felt almost surreal to the people living through it. Men came home. Factories switched from making bombs to making refrigerators. Suburbs were rising out of empty fields so fast that by 1950, developers were completing a new house somewhere in America every 16 minutes. The American dream was not just a phrase, it was a floor plan. And somewhere in that floor plan, in the spotless kitchen, at the polished dining table, in the small bathroom with its oval mirror and its chrome shelf, was the American woman. Now I want to be careful here. The 1950s is a decade that people tend to flatten into either a golden paradise or a suffocating nightmare. The truth, as it always is, sits somewhere far more human than either of those. Yes, there were real pressures on women in this era. The expectation that a woman's worth was tied to her appearance, her home, and her husband was not imaginary. It was written into beauty guides, advertisements, and the quiet social rules that no one said out loud but everyone understood. For many women, beauty was not a choice, it was a requirement. But there was also something else happening, something that tends to get lost in the rush to criticize or to romanticize. There was a culture of female self-knowledge that was quietly remarkable. Women in the 1950s had beauty guides. Not the chaotic scroll of algorithm-driven content we live inside today. Actual books, actual pamphlets, columns in women's magazines that treated skincare as a serious learnable discipline. Books like The Handbook of Beauty by Constance Hart, published in 1955, laid out morning and evening routines in meticulous, almost tender detail, step by step, habit by habit. The kind of writing that suggests the author genuinely believed that a woman caring for her skin was doing something worth doing well. Here is what the average American woman's beauty life actually looked like in this decade. Not the movie star version, the real version. She would wake up and apply cold cream to her face before she made coffee. Not out of vanity, out of habit, and out of the quiet understanding that cleansing was not optional. She would brush her hair with intention 50 strokes in the morning, 50 more in the evening, sometimes more. She would press a cotton pad soaked in witch hazel to her skin. She would rub a little petroleum jelly onto her lashes and brows. Something that sounds strange until you notice that castor oil lash serums are currently selling online for $38 a bottle and doing essentially the same thing. She would steam her face over a bowl of hot water once or twice a week. She would go to bed with a thin layer of cream still on her skin left there overnight to do its quiet work. And she would do all of this again the next day, without deviation, without the existential spiral of wondering whether retinol conflict with vitamin C, whether her pH is balanced, whether she needs a separate serum for her neck. Just consistent daily unhurried attention. By 1955, American women were spending roughly $900 million per year on cosmetics and skincare. In today's money, that is close to $11 billion. Brands like Revlon Pond's Max Factor and Avon, which launched its now legendary Ding Dong Avon Calling campaign in 1954 and had over 100,000 representatives by 1957, were growing faster than their executives could quite believe, and yet the routines themselves were simple. Cold cream, astringent, moisturizer. A handful of steps repeated daily with real ingredients that had been used for decades before any of those brands existed. There is a beautiful irony in that. The most commercially successful early chapter of the beauty industry was built on simplicity and consistency. Today, when the global beauty industry is worth over $500 billion, we are drowning in complexity and still arguing about whether our skin is actually any better for it. But I want to be honest with you because honesty is the whole point of this hour. Not everything in the 1953 medicine cabinet was a forgotten gem waiting to be rediscovered. Some of it caused real harm. The ideal of feminine beauty in this era was explicitly, unapologetically narrow, white, thin, pale-skinned. Products marketed for skin lightening were common and enthusiastic. Women whose appearance did not match the cultural standard were not encouraged to celebrate themselves. They were given products designed to make them look different from what they were. We cannot wander through the beauty habits of this decade and say only, "Wasn't it lovely, those simple routines?" without also asking lovely for whom. In part 11 we'll look at that darker chapter directly and honestly. But I raise it now because it shapes how we hold everything else with genuine appreciation for what worked, and open eyes about what the era also got terribly wrong. The thread I want you to keep hold of as we travel through the next several hours together is this: beauty in 1953 was understood as a practice, not an event, not a makeover, not a before and after, a daily return to the mirror with unhurried hands and quiet intention. And that idea that taking care of yourself is something you come back to every single day, not something you fix once and forget, is still true. It was true before Revlon existed. It will be true long after whatever serum everyone is talking about next year fades from the algorithm. The woman at the oval mirror knew something. Let us go find out what it was. Coming up next, the double cleanse. The ritual that women in the 1950s performed every morning without giving it a name, and that the skincare industry rediscovered 7 decades later and began selling back to us for $80 a bottle. The story of cold cream is older and stranger than almost anything you would expect. It begins not in post-war America but in ancient Rome with a physician named Galen, a mixing bowl, and a surprising amount of beeswax. Stay with me. There is a story that the beauty industry does not particularly want you to know. It goes something like this. Sometime in the early 2000s, a Korean skincare trend swept through beauty magazines and YouTube tutorials and dermatology blogs, and the world collectively gasped and said, "Oh my goodness, have you heard about the double cleanse?" First an oil-based cleanser to dissolve makeup and sunscreen, then a water-based cleanser to clear everything else. Brilliant, revolutionary, groundbreaking. And the women in the 1950s, had they been alive to witness this moment, would have set down their jars of Pond's cold cream, looked at each other across the kitchen table and said, "Well, dear, we have been doing that since before you were born." Because here is what nobody mentions in those glowing double cleanse tutorials: it is not a Korean invention. It is not a 2012 invention. It is depending on how you count somewhere between 100 and nearly 2,000 years old. And the women of post-war America had it figured out without a single influencer to tell them how. Let us go back even further than 1953. Let us go all the way back to the 2nd century of the Common Era, to a city called Pergamon in what is now Western Turkey, to a physician named Galen, who was by any reasonable measure one of the most remarkable intellects of the ancient world. Galen served as physician to Roman emperors. He wrote over 500 medical texts. His theories about the human body dominated Western medicine for nearly 1,300 years after his death, a record that, as far as I know, no one has come close to breaking since. And at some point in his long and extraordinarily well-documented life, Galen sat down and made a cream. He called it Ceratum Galeni Galen's wax. The recipe was elegantly simple water infused with roses, molten beeswax, and olive oil. You mix the two together, and here is the part that apparently drove his assistants mad. You mix them for a very, very long time, because oil and water have no particular interest in becoming friends, and it takes genuine persistence to convince them otherwise. What resulted was an emulsion, a cream that sat on the skin, slowly releasing its water content into the air, and as that water evaporated, it cooled the skin. It felt cold, which is exactly why roughly 1,700 years later, we still call the descendants of Galen's recipe cold cream. Think about that for a moment. You're using a skincare concept invented by a Roman physician who also treated the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. That small jar of Pond's in your grandmother's medicine cabinet, direct descendant of ancient Rome. Skincare has a longer memory than we give it credit for. Now the recipe changed over the centuries, as all good recipes do. Almond oil replaced the olive oil at some point because almond oil was lighter and less prone to going rancid. In the 17th century, the herbalist Nicholas Culpeper included a version of Galen's cream in his writings, describing it in the kind of earnest, slightly eccentric prose that makes old medical texts so delightful to read. By the 19th century, a small amount of borax had been added to the water phase, which reacted chemically with the fatty acids in the beeswax to create a more stable, whiter, smoother emulsion, the direct ancestor of the creams we recognize today. And then came the industrialization of the formula. The plant oils were replaced with mineral oil because mineral oil was cheaper, more stable, and did not go rancid on a shelf. This is also where the brand names we recognize entered the picture. Pond's had been selling remedies since the 1860s, but by the early 20th century the company had repositioned itself around cold cream and vanishing cream, marketing them as essential skincare products for the modern woman. By the 1950s, Pond's cold cream had become so ubiquitous that it was less a brand and more a household fixture like the toaster or the telephone. You simply had it. Everyone had it. Noxzema came along with a slightly different approach: stearic acid base, linseed and soybean oils, a distinctive cooling tingle from eucalyptus that made you feel with absolute certainty that the product was doing something. Whether or not the eucalyptus was entirely necessary from a skincare standpoint is a separate conversation, but from a sensory standpoint, the women who grew up with Noxzema will tell you that tingle was the point. It was the feeling of cleanliness made physical, and that is actually not a trivial thing, as we will discuss in a moment. So what were women in 1953 actually doing with all this cold cream? Here is the sequence described in beauty guides of the era, with the kind of precise, almost maternal authority that I find genuinely charming. First cream on the face, smoothed on with gentle upward circular motions. The guides were very specific about the upward direction. The theory at the time was that pulling skin downward contributed to sagging, and while the full science on this is more complicated than the 1950s understood it, to be the principle of treating the skin gently rather than dragging at it, turns out to be genuinely good advice. Modern dermatologists will tell you the same thing. Second, the cream, now full of dissolved makeup and the accumulated debris of the day, was removed. Not rinsed. Removed. With cotton wool or with tissues in long, firm outward strokes. The beauty guides of the era were almost obsessive about using a clean part of the cotton or tissue for each stroke, never dragging the same surface back across the face. You were in essence lifting the day off your skin rather than smearing it around. Third, and this is the part that makes it a double cleanse, a follow-up with either soap and water or witch hazel on a cotton pad, or cool water alone to clear whatever residue the cream had left behind. The skin was then patted dry, never rubbed, and prepared for whatever came next. Do you see what they were doing? The first step was oil-based. The cold cream dissolving oil-soluble impurities, breaking down makeup, lifting away sunscreen. The second step cleared the residue from the first step. It is the exact logic that modern double cleansing advocates describe as though they discovered it themselves. The mechanism is identical, only the language has changed. Now, I want to be honest about something here, because this is the kind of thing that gets glossed over in the wasn't the 50s wonderful version of this story. The mineral oil in commercial cold creams of the 1950s was effective as a cleanser and a temporary emollient, but it is what scientists call occlusive. It sits on top of the skin and creates a barrier rather than genuinely feeding it. For some skin types, this was fine. For others, particularly those prone to clogged pores, leaving cold cream residue on the skin without a thorough follow-up wash could cause problems. Some women noticed this intuitively and adapted their routines accordingly. Others, following the guides to the letter, found the cream too heavy and switched to soap, which brought its own set of issues. Soap in the 1950s was almost uniformly alkaline, with a pH that disrupted the skin's natural acid mantle and left it feeling tight and stripped. The women of the 50s were navigating a landscape of limited options with considerable ingenuity. The ones who got it right were the ones who listened to their own skin rather than following any single guide absolutely. And that, I think, is a lesson that applies to every era. There is something else about the cold cream ritual that I find quietly fascinating, and it has nothing to do with chemistry. In 1955, the Handbook of Beauty described the nightly cream application as a moment of preparation for sleep, yes, but also in a sense for oneself. The act of sitting down at the mirror, taking the time to smooth cream onto your face, to breathe in the faint floral scent, to feel the coolness on your skin, this was not rushed. It was deliberate. Beauty guides of the era used words like ritual and routine almost interchangeably, and there is a reason for that. Contemporary neuroscience has a lot to say about the relationship between consistent sensory rituals and the nervous system. Repetitive, gentle, predictable actions, the kind you do the same way every evening at the same time in the same order, have a measurable effect on the brain's ability to transition into a calmer state. The act of the routine is itself the point, not just its ingredients. When a woman of the 1950s sat at her vanity and went through her cold cream ritual, she was doing something that we would now call a wind-down practice. She just did not have the therapy language for it. The question worth sitting with is whether we, with our 37 product routines and our anxiety about whether we're using them in the correct order, have actually improved on that. I am not sure we have. Let me tell you about a detail from the 1955 handbook that I keep coming back to. Constance Hart, when describing the nightly cream application, wrote that the process should end with a moment of stillness, not stretched out, not elaborate, just a pause, A few seconds of simply looking at your own face in the mirror before turning off the light. She described this almost matter-of-factly, as though it were as obvious as washing your hands, and I wonder how many women actually did it. I wonder how many of them needed it more than they realized. There is something in that small instruction, the quiet pause at the mirror, that feels relevant to our era, in a way that goes beyond skincare. We live in a moment when we're encouraged to do everything faster, to optimize every minute, to turn every ritual into an efficiency exercise. The cold cream ritual of the 1950s resists all of that. It is slow on purpose. It is tactile on purpose. It asks for your full unhurried attention for 5 minutes at the end of the day, and it gives you clean skin in return. As bargains go, that is not a bad one. I want to ask you something, and you do not have to answer out loud, obviously, since it is just us here in the quiet. But think about it. When was the last time you washed your face slowly? Not in the shower where you're already on your way somewhere. Not with one hand while scrolling with the other. Just slowly, with both hands, paying attention to what you're doing. If you cannot remember, you are in excellent company. Most of us cannot. The women of 1953 were not more virtuous than us. They were not wiser about skincare in any technical sense. They simply did not have our particular form of distraction yet. The phone had not arrived to eat the quiet. The algorithm had not yet turned bedtime into an event. And so they stood at the mirror and they took their time. And something in that unhurried attention, something that we have lost along the way, kept their skin cleaner and their evenings calmer than perhaps they even knew. The double cleanse was only the first step. Once the face was clean, women of this era reach for a second bottle, something that no modern skincare routine can seem to decide whether to include or not, something that has been dismissed and rehabilitated so many times that it has its own kind of drama. They reach for the toner, and not just any toner. They reach for something that grew out of the ground, that has been used on human skin for centuries, and that has the mildly absurd quality of being simultaneously very old and very trendy. They reach for witch hazel. What it was, where it came from, and why it actually works, that is exactly where we are headed next. Witch hazel. 2 words that sound like they belong in a fairy tale, or possibly in a grandmother's medicine cabinet behind the aspirin and the band-aids. And in a way, that second one is exactly where they lived for most of the 20th century, quietly without fanfare on the second shelf, in a brown bottle with a plain white label. Unremarkable, dependable, largely forgotten by the generation that came after, which is a genuine shame, because the story of witch hazel is one of those stories where a plant that humans have been using intelligently for centuries gets dismissed as old-fashioned right around the moment that corporations realize they cannot patent it. And then some decades later, the beauty industry rediscovers it, slaps a new label on the bottle, and sells it back to us for $25 with the word botanical printed in a tasteful font. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let us start at the beginning. The beginning is in the forests of the eastern United States, and it belongs to the indigenous peoples of North America long before any European ever set foot on the continent. Amamelis virginiana. The plant we now call witch hazel is a deciduous shrub that grows along stream banks and hillsides from Nova Scotia, down through the Appalachians and into parts of the Gulf Coast. It is an odd-looking thing, with small yellow flowers that bloom in late autumn after all the other flowers have long since given up and gone to sleep. There is something quietly stubborn about a plant that chooses to flower in November, something that suggests it plays by its own rules. Indigenous communities across eastern North America recognized the plant's medicinal value and used it with considerable sophistication. Various nations used preparations from the bark and leaves to treat swelling, to soothe irritated skin, and to ease muscle aches. Poultices were made, steam treatments were prepared, decoctions were applied with care and knowledge built up across generations. This was not guesswork. This was an accumulated body of botanical understanding that had been refined over an extraordinarily long period of time. When European settlers arrived and began learning from indigenous healers, and that exchange, complex and often exploitative as it was undeniably happened, witch hazel travelled into the settler pharmacopoeia. By the mid-1800s it was being commercially distilled for the first time, and by the late 1800s the product we recognise today, a clear liquid extract, produced by steam distilling the twigs and bark, had become a staple in American and European medicine cabinets. Theron Pond, a pharmacist from Utica, New York, began selling a witch hazel extract in the 1840s that eventually evolved into the Pond's brand we discussed in our previous chapter. The origins are deeply intertwined. By the 1950s, witch hazel was simply there. It was part of the landscape of everyday American life in a way that requires no explanation to anyone who grew up in a certain kind of household. You used it after shaving, you dabbed it on bug bites, you applied it to your face after washing on a cotton pad as a toner. It was priced for everyone. It required no special knowledge, and it worked. Now here is the part where I want to slow down and get specific, because this is where things get genuinely interesting. What makes witch hazel effective on skin is a collection of chemical compounds that the plant produces naturally. Primarily tannins, flavonoids, gallic acid, and various other polyphenols. These are not marketing terms. These are real, measurable, biologically active molecules with documented effects on human tissue. Tannins, which are present in relatively high concentrations in witch hazel bark and leaves, are astringents. When they come into contact with skin, they cause a temporary tightening of surface proteins, which is why witch hazel on a cotton pad leaves the skin feeling firmer and more refined. It is not magic, it is chemistry. Specifically, it is the same class of chemistry that makes a strong cup of tea leave your mouth feeling slightly dry and taut. Tea contains tannins too, which is one of those small facts that makes the world feel pleasingly interconnected. The flavonoids in witch hazel have documented anti-inflammatory properties. They modulate the kinds of cellular signaling pathways that drive redness and irritation. For women in the 1950s who were applying witch hazel after washing their faces, often with alkaline bar soap that left their skin slightly inflamed, this was genuinely useful. They may not have known why it helped calm their skin, but they knew that it did. And the plant's antimicrobial properties are real enough that the United States Food and Drug Administration has approved witch hazel for use in over-the-counter formulations. When the regulatory body of the United States federal government officially acknowledges that something has a legitimate medical application, it is worth paying attention to. So when a woman in 1953 pressed a cotton pad soaked in witch hazel to her face after cleansing, she was not engaged in superstition. She was applying a plant-derived astringent anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial preparation to her skin. She just would not have described it that way because that level of biochemical vocabulary was not how people talked about their bathroom routines in 1953. They would have said it made their skin feel fresh, which it did, for reasons that science has since taken the time to explain in considerable detail. But here is the complication, and there is always a complication which is part of what makes skincare history so genuinely instructive. The witch hazel sold commercially in the 1950s and still sold today in its standard form is distilled with alcohol. Specifically, the liquid extract contains roughly 14 to 15% alcohol by volume, and alcohol on skin is a subject that the dermatological community has become considerably more nuanced about over the past several decades. The alcohol serves a purpose, it acts as a solvent during the distillation process, it provides a preservative function, and it contributes to that characteristic sensation of tightness and freshness that makes witch hazel feel so immediately effective. But for some skin types, particularly dry or sensitive skin, the alcohol content can cause the very irritation it is supposed to address. It can disrupt the skin's moisture barrier over time with repeated use. It can strip natural oils that the skin needs. Women in the 1950s did not know any of this in the terms we now use to discuss it. Some of them probably found witch hazel too drying and stopped using it. Others with oilier or more resilient skin likely found it genuinely beneficial and used it for decades. This is the recurring pattern of this era: intuitive self-knowledge, filling in the gaps where scientific understanding was not yet available. The modern recommendation for those interested in incorporating witch hazel into a contemporary routine is to look for alcohol-free or distillate versions which retain the tannins and polyphenols without the drying effects of the alcohol. The botanical benefit is real, the vehicle matters, and then there was the other bottle on the toner shelf, the one that looked less clinical, smelled considerably better, and carried with it a history so old and so global that describing it as merely a 1950s beauty product feels almost comically inadequate. Rose water. If witch hazel belongs to the forests of Appalachia, rose water belongs to an entirely different geography, to the ancient cities of Persia, to the court physicians and royal gardens of a civilization that understood the chemical potential of flowers long before modern perfumery gave us a language for it. The history of rosewater is, depending on how seriously you take it, either remarkably well documented or tantalizingly difficult to pin down. What is generally agreed upon is this: the process of distilling roses into a concentrated liquid was developed in the Persian world most likely around the 10th century of the Common Era, and the figure most closely associated with systematizing that process is the physician and polymath Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna. He is one of the most extraordinary minds in the history of medicine, a man who wrote an encyclopedia of medical knowledge that was used as a primary medical text in both the Islamic world and in European universities for centuries. Among his many contributions, he documented the steam distillation of rose petals and recommended the resulting liquid for everything from eye conditions to digestive complaints to memory difficulties. What Avicenna produced from those rose petals, the water captured in the steam as the flowers were heated, is essentially what we still call rose water today. 1 litre of it requires somewhere between 600 and 700 individual rose blossoms. Think about that for a moment. The economy of patience that represents, the value placed on the finished product. Rose water travelled westward along trade routes and through the movements of empires. By the 17th century it had become so prized in parts of Europe that it was used as actual currency in some transactions. By the 18th and 19th centuries it had found its way into European pharmacies and beauty preparations. And by the 1950s a bottle of rose water on an American woman's bathroom shelf was not unusual at all, though it was perhaps less universal than witch hazel, more associated with women who had access to specialty druggists, or who came from certain cultural traditions where its use had never been interrupted. Why does rose water work on skin? Let us be accurate about this, because the beauty industry has made claims about rose water that range from the well-supported to the frankly optimistic, and part of honouring this history is distinguishing between the two. What is genuinely established rose water is mildly anti-inflammatory, partly due to its phenolic content. It is a gentle astringent. It helps restore a slightly acidic skin pH after cleansing, and skin pH matters significantly because the skin's natural acid mantle is its first line of defense against bacteria and environmental irritants, and alkaline cleansers disrupt it. A mild acidic rinse after cleansing is actually good practice, and rose water delivers it gently. What is less certain? The dramatic anti-aging claims, the collagen-boosting assertions, the promise of visible brightness within days. A 2020 study did find that rose water showed some antioxidant activity in human subjects, but the research on rose water's more spectacular claimed benefits is still, as researchers tend to put it, with polite understatement, limited. Which means the jury is still out. Which means we should be enthusiastic but honest. The women of the 1950s who used rosewater were not doing so because of clinical trials. They were doing so because it felt good, because it smelled beautiful, and because their skin felt calmer and more comfortable after using it. Those are real outcomes. They are worth something. There is a broader point here that I keep returning to the more time I spend in this era. The toner cabinet of a woman in 1953, witch hazel on one side, perhaps rose water on the other, perhaps just cold water splashed from the tap, represents a philosophy that we have largely abandoned. It was the philosophy of the single purposeful ingredient. The idea that one plant used consistently, applied with knowledge and care, could do something meaningful for your skin over time. Not everything at once. Not all 12 actives in one serum. One thing, chosen thoughtfully, applied regularly. The modern skincare industry has built an empire on complexity. And I do not say that entirely as a criticism. Some of that complexity represents genuine scientific progress, and some of the products developed in the last 30 years are genuinely more effective than anything available in the 1950s. But complexity has a cost. It creates confusion. It creates the constant anxiety that you're doing it wrong, using things in the wrong order, mixing actives that should not be mixed. It creates dependency on expertise rather than self-knowledge. The woman at the 1953 bathroom shelf knew her skin. She knew what made it tight and what made it calm. She knew which products she had used for 10 years without problems, and which one had broken her out last spring. That knowledge was hard-won and personal, and she trusted it. There is something to be said for that kind of confidence in your own experience, something that the infinite scroll of skincare advice has in a certain way stolen from us. I want to leave you with a small observation before we move forward into the next chapter. The word toner in the modern sense, a liquid applied after cleansing, and before moisturizer, has been through more identity crises than perhaps any other category in skincare. In the 1950s and 60s, toners were often primarily astringent and slightly harsh. In the 1980s and 90s, many toners were essentially glorified alcohol preparations that stripped the skin. There was a period in the early 2000s when the skincare community largely agreed that toners were unnecessary and no one needed them. Then Korean skincare arrived and the toner was rehabilitated as an essential hydrating step. Now there are toning essences and toning serums and toning waters and mists and sprays, and the category has proliferated so enthusiastically that it has become genuinely difficult to know what a toner actually is supposed to do. The women of the 1950s did not have this problem. They had a bottle of witch hazel, and if they were feeling particularly luxurious, a bottle of rose water. They knew what each one did. They applied them with a cotton pad in about 15 seconds, and then they moved on with their evening. There is a clarity in that simplicity that is worth more than any number of beautifully branded bottles. Speaking of simplicity, and of things that seem obvious once you understand them, but that the modern world has managed to dramatically overcomplicate, we're about to arrive at one of the strangest beauty habits of this entire era. A habit that women were taught to perform every single morning and every single evening with more repetitions than most people do push-ups in a month. A habit that feels almost meditative in its rhythm and that modern dermatologists have genuinely mixed feelings about. 100 strokes, every day, without fail. The great hair-brushing tradition of the 1950s is a story about sebum and about the science of the scalp, and about a very specific kind of devotion to one's own appearance that this era seemed to cultivate in women with remarkable consistency. It is also the story of when a good habit tips into excess, and of what happens when the advice that serves most people becomes the advice that harms a few. That story is coming up right now. 100 strokes. Say it out loud and it sounds almost absurd in the context of modern life. 100 strokes of a hairbrush every single day, morning and evening. Some guides said 50 in the morning and 50 at night. Others, more ambitious, prescribed the full 100 as a nightly ritual alone. Whatever the specific count, the number was everywhere in the beauty literature of the 1950s in magazine columns and household guides, in the manuals that mothers handed to daughters, in the advice dispensed by hairdressers who treated their clients not just as customers, but as pupils. And for decades, nobody questioned it. It was simply what you did. Like making the bed or setting the table, it was one of those habits so thoroughly embedded in the daily routine of the American woman that its origins had become almost invisible. Just one of those things that was true because it had always been true. Until somewhere in the 1980s and 90s, the beauty industry looked up from its product development meetings and decided that 100 strokes was in fact terrible advice that was damaging your hair and that you should stop immediately. Which is what most of us were told. Which is what most of us believed. The reality, as it almost always is, turned out to be considerably more nuanced than either version of the story. To understand where the 100-stroke rule actually came from, you need to understand something about the history of hair washing that most people do not know, because it genuinely reshapes the entire picture. For most of human history, and I mean the vast majority of it, not just a century or two, washing your hair with water and soap was considered somewhere between inadvisable and actively harmful. This was not purely ignorance. There were practical reasons. The soaps available before the 20th century were alkaline preparations made with lye bases, and alkaline substances are chemically incompatible with hair. Hair and scalp are naturally slightly acidic, and washing with a strongly alkaline soap stripped the hair of its protective oils, left it brittle and dry, made it extraordinarily difficult to manage, and for women with long hair, which until the 1920s was essentially every woman could cause what we might now call catastrophic damage. A woman washing waist-length hair with lye-based soap was not performing self-care. She was performing a kind of slow structural demolition, so they did not do it very often. The general recommendation in the early 20th century was to wash hair roughly once every 2 to 4 weeks, sometimes less. And in the decades before even that level of washing became normalized, the interval could be considerably longer. This was not laziness or poor hygiene in the way we might now understand it. It was the rational adaptation of a population to the tools actually available to them. Which brings us directly to the brush. If you're not washing your hair very often, something else needs to manage the sebum, the natural oil produced by the scalp that accumulates between washes. Sebum is not a problem in itself. It is actually rather important. It coats and protects the hair shaft, keeps the ends from drying and splitting, and maintains the health of the scalp. The trouble is that sebum is heavier than hair. Gravity pulls it down and it pulls at the roots, leaving the scalp oily and the ends dry. The mid-lengths get something, but the ends, particularly on long hair, often get very little. A boar bristle brush applied with consistent strokes from root to tip is one of the most mechanically efficient solutions to this problem that the pre-shampoo era ever produced. The natural bristles, being similar in structure to human hair, are capable of lifting sebum from the scalp and transporting it physically along the hair shaft, distributing it more evenly from roots toward the ends. You're essentially using the brush as a delivery system for your scalp's own natural conditioning oil. 100 strokes was the number that, through generations of trial and observation, women found sufficient to do the job. It was not arbitrary. It was empirical, the outcome of paying close attention to what actually worked. Meanwhile, the brushing stimulated the scalp. It increased blood circulation to the follicles. It loosened dead skin cells and debris from the scalp surface, which would then be transferred to the brush bristles. Women washed their brushes regularly as a result, daily in many cases, which was itself a form of scalp hygiene. The brush was doing two jobs at once, distributing the good stuff and removing the stuff that needed to go. The picture starts to shift when you add modern shampoo into it. Synthetic liquid shampoo in the form recognizable today was introduced to mass markets in the early 1950s. The first synthetic detergent-based shampoos had arrived in the 1930s. Procter & Gamble introduced a formulation in 1934 that used detergents rather than soap, which was gentler and more pH appropriate for hair, but it was in the post-war era that the shampoo industry truly exploded. By the 1950s, brands were advertising weekly hair washing as not just possible but desirable. By the 1960s, the frequency had inched up further. By the 1980s, daily washing had become the norm for a significant portion of the American population. And this is where the 100-stroke rule runs into trouble. Modern shampoo is extraordinarily effective at removing sebum. It does this job arguably too well, stripping not just the excess oil, but the oil the hair actually needs, leaving the shaft dry and the ends vulnerable. If you are washing your hair daily or every other day with a modern detergent shampoo, your hair is not carrying the same sebum load that it was in the era when the 100-stroke rule was developed. This sebum simply is not there to distribute. And running a brush, particularly a plastic brush with stiff synthetic bristles, which became the mass-market norm as boar bristle brushes fell out of fashion through already dry detergent-stripped hair 100 times, is not conditioning it. It is creating friction. It is lifting and damaging the hair cuticle. It is, as the beauty industry correctly identified, causing breakage. So the critics of the 100-stroke rule were not entirely wrong. In the context of modern hair washing habits and modern plastic brushes, excessive brushing genuinely does cause damage. The American Academy of Dermatology does recommend against it for exactly this reason, but this is the part that tends to get lost in the debunking. Those critics were arguing against a rule that had been developed for an entirely different set of conditions. They were criticizing the tool without accounting for the context. The 100-stroke rule made perfect sense for what it was designed to do. It just stopped making sense when the underlying conditions changed, and the advice failed to change with them. That, I think, is worth sitting with for a moment. How much of what we confidently dismiss as outdated wisdom is actually sophisticated adaptation to conditions that no longer exist? And how much of the wisdom we have replaced it with is equally context-dependent, equally likely to look strange to someone examining it from 100 years in the future? Can I ask you something? Do you know how often you actually brush your hair? Not as a precise number. I mean whether you do it deliberately and thoughtfully as part of an intentional routine, or whether it happens in passing in the 30 seconds before you leave the house with whatever brush is nearest. Because the women of the 1950s sat down to brush their hair. They made time for it. They counted the strokes, or at least maintained some approximation of counting. It was a thing they did with their full attention at a particular hour as part of a sequence of care. The brushing was never just about the hair. The scalp massage that came with it, 2 minutes of stimulating pressure, applied to the scalp before brushing, recommended in the same 1955 handbook we've been returning to throughout this story, had its own function. Scalp massage increases blood flow to the hair follicles. Studies conducted in Japan in 2016 found that standardized scalp massage over a period of 24 weeks produced measurable increases in hair thickness in participants. The mechanism is understood. More circulation means more nutrients delivered to the follicle, more efficient waste removal, better conditions for healthy hair growth. The women who massaged their scalps before brushing were doing something genuinely useful, even if they could not have explained the cellular mechanism. The brushing itself, when done with a natural bristle brush, and without stripping shampoo in the background altering the sebum picture, produced genuinely lustrous results. Women of this era, who maintained consistent brushing routines combined with infrequent washing that allowed the scalp's natural oils to do their job frequently, had what we would now recognize as remarkably healthy hair. Not because they had some magic product, because they had a system and they stuck to it. And the system happened to work with the biology of hair rather than against it. There is a piece of this history that I find genuinely poignant, and it has nothing to do with sebum distribution. In the 1950s, the nightly brushing of one's hair was one of the last remaining ritual act of a much older tradition of female grooming. In the centuries before the 20th century, women in many cultures spent considerable time each evening having their hair brushed by a maid if they could afford one, or by a sister or mother or daughter, or alone in front of a mirror by lamplight. It was intimate. It was repetitive in the way that all genuinely soothing activities are repetitive. It was a way of transitioning from the demands of the day into the quiet of the night. By the 1950s, the maids were mostly gone. Domestic service had declined dramatically in the post-war period, and women who had grown up in households with help were now doing their own grooming without assistance for the first time. But the ritual persisted, translated into the solitary act of sitting at the vanity table and counting to 100. There is something in that image, the woman alone at the mirror brush moving through her hair with the rhythm of a deliberate practice. The room dark except for the vanity light that feels both domestic and strangely meditative. It is, when you think about it, one of the oldest forms of self-care that humans have ever practiced. The grooming ritual, not as vanity but as the deliberate turning of attention toward oneself after a day spent attending to everyone else. What does the science actually recommend now, stripped of all the back and forth of the debunking cycle? Moderate brushing, perhaps 20 to 40 strokes with a natural boar bristle brush or a gentle paddle brush, is beneficial for most hair types. It distributes whatever natural oils the scalp has produced, it stimulates circulation, and it removes debris from the scalp and hair shaft. The key variables are the type of brush, the frequency of hair washing, and the condition of the hair itself. Damaged hair needs more care, not more friction. Long hair should be brushed from the ends upward, working toward the roots, not root to tip, which prevents accumulating tangles into knots. Wet hair should not be vigorously brushed at all. Wet hair is at its most elastic and vulnerable, and brushing it aggressively is the most reliable way to cause breakage. These are not radical discoveries. Several of them appear in some form in the beauty guides of the 1950s themselves. Constance Hart's handbook was specific about gentle technique, about not dragging the brush roughly through the hair, about treating the process as an act of care rather than an act of speed. The 100-stroke number was always more symbol than science. It symbolized patience and repetition, rather than a precise prescription. It reinforced the idea that care compounds over time, that doing something attentively day after day produces results that no single dramatic intervention can match. That idea is not outdated. That idea is, if anything, more relevant in our era of instant solutions and overnight promises than it was in 1953. From the crown of the head, we're heading somewhere considerably more surprising next. Because while women in the 1950s were brushing their hair with patient devotion, they were also doing something else, something that sounds almost disturbingly practical when you first hear it, something that seems like it belongs to a different era entirely, and something that has more scientific backing than almost anyone gives it credit for. They were steaming their faces over a bowl of hot water with a towel draped over their heads for 5 to 10 minutes at a time, a couple of times a week, and the story of why and what it actually does to the skin, and why it disappeared, and why certain corners of the skincare world are very quietly bringing it back, is one of the most quietly fascinating chapters in this entire series of forgotten habits. Picture the scene: a woman in her kitchen sometime around 1952. The kettle has just boiled. She pours the water into a ceramic bowl, not a special device, not an electrical appliance with a digital timer and 3 adjustable settings, just a bowl, and carries it to the bathroom. She drapes a large towel over her shoulders. She leans over the rising steam, pulls the towel up over her head to trap the warmth, and stays there, face tilted downward into the soft white cloud, for somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. Twice a week she does this. Sometimes once, sometimes a little more often in winter when the dry air inside the house dries out her skin in ways that the cold cream alone cannot entirely fix. Nobody told her to call it a facial. Nobody charged her $45 for the experience. It was simply something she did learned from her mother, or a magazine column, or the quiet accumulation of what worked filed away in the practical knowledge that women passed between each other as casually as recipes. She had no idea that what she was doing had roots stretching back nearly 2,000 years. She probably would not have cared very much if you had told her. It worked. That was enough. Steam and human skin have understood each other for a very long time. Long before the woman in 1952 with her kitchen kettle, long before any commercial facial treatment or spa service civilizations around the world had discovered independently through observation rather than science that exposing the skin to warm steam produced visible, tangible, desirable results. The Roman thermae were not merely bathhouses. They were some of the most architecturally sophisticated public buildings in the ancient world, designed around a deliberate sequence of temperature exposure, cold rooms, warm rooms, hot chambers filled with steam and heat, then back to cold. Citizens of Rome, all social classes, not just the wealthy, spent hours there each day moving through this sequence as casually as we might take a morning walk. The scraped skin, the steamed pores, the plunge into cool water afterward, this was civic life in ancient Rome. It was ordinary, it was expected, and it produced skin that historians of antiquity describe with what seems like genuine envy as remarkably healthy in texture and appearance. From Rome the tradition migrated. The Ottoman Empire built the hammam, the Turkish bath, which combined the Roman thermal sequence with Islamic practices of ritual cleansing, and added its own particular genius for steam exfoliation and the art of the communal bathing experience. In Istanbul, at the height of Ottoman culture, a great hammam was as much a social institution as a bathing facility. Women went in groups. Marriages were sometimes arranged in hammams. It was where you caught up on news, where you assessed potential daughters-in-law, where you spent hours in warmth and conversation while the steam did its work on your skin. There is something rather wonderful about that, the idea of a beauty treatment so deeply embedded in social life that you might negotiate a family alliance while your pores were being opened. By the 19th century, the Turkish bath had made its way to Europe, where it was received with the kind of enthusiasm that the Victorians tended to bring to anything they believed had health benefits. The first Victorian Turkish bath opened in Ireland in 1856, built by a physician named Richard Barter, who'd read about the hammam and was by his own account electrified by the concept. Within a few decades, Turkish bathhouses were operating in cities throughout Britain, France and Germany. The tradition was being domesticated, adapted, made available for those who could not visit an actual bathhouse. And what emerged from that domestication, filtered through the beauty culture of the early 20th century, was the home facial steam bath. By the 1950s, it was simply part of the vocabulary. Beauty guides described it matter-of-factly alongside cold cream and witch hazel, and the 100-stroke brush rule. You steamed your face, twice a week roughly, over a bowl under a towel. It was not exotic, it was not a luxury, it was maintenance. So what is actually happening to skin during those 5 to 10 minutes under the towel? Because this is where the 19th century empirical tradition and 21st century dermatology end up perhaps surprisingly in fairly close agreement. Here is the mechanism as we now understand it. When warm steam envelops the face, several things happen simultaneously. The heat causes vasodilation. The blood vessels near the skin surface expand, blood flow increases, and more oxygen and nutrients are delivered to the skin cells. This is why after steaming the face appears flushed and glowing. It is not a superficial cosmetic effect. It is increased circulation made visible. Simultaneously, the heat and moisture together work on the outermost layer of the skin, the stratum corneum, which is the barrier layer of dead and dying skin cells that forms the skin's first line of defense. This layer is largely composed of proteins called keratins, and heat softens keratin. When the stratum corneum softens, several things become easier debris, and excess sebum that have collected in the pores loosen the skin becomes more permeable, and any products applied to the face afterward, whether that is cold cream, a moisturizer, or in a modern routine a serum, can penetrate more effectively. A study published in a dermatology journal in 2018 found measurable evidence that warm steam applied before cleansing increased skin permeability, allowing subsequent treatments to work with greater efficiency. This is not a small finding. It means that 5 minutes of steam before your skincare routine is not self-indulgent. It is in measurable terms making your products more effective. The women in 1952 who steamed before applying their cold cream were, without knowing the science, optimizing their absorption. Intuitively, empirically, because it worked. Now, I want to be careful here, as I always try to be about what the science does and does not actually support. One of the most persistent myths about facial steaming, and it is a myth that the beauty industry has perpetuated enthusiastically for decades, because it sounds so satisfying, is that steam opens your pores. Open your pores, says every spa brochure ever written. Close your pores with cold water afterward. Pores do not open and close. They are fixed structures. They do not have doors. They are not miniature mouths that gape in heat and pucker in cold. A board-certified dermatologist explaining this for the first time to patients gets what I can only imagine is a familiar expression of mild devastation on the patient's face, because open your pores is such a beautifully logical idea that it genuinely hurts to have it dismantled. What actually happens is that steam softens the material inside the pores, the sebum and dead skin cells and debris, making it more pliable and easier to remove. The pore structure itself does not change, but the contents of the pore become much more accessible, which is why facialists have always performed steam before any extraction work. It is not opening a door, it is softening a plug so it slides out more easily. The cold water at the end is not closing your pores either. What it is doing is reducing the vasodilation, constricting those blood vessels that the heat expanded, which reduces the flushed plump appearance and makes the skin feel temporarily tighter. That temporary tightness feels like closed pores. It is not. But the distinction matters because misunderstanding it has led generations of people to believe that their beauty rituals are doing things they are not, which is the kind of confusion that eventually leads to disappointment and abandonment of what might otherwise be a genuinely useful practice. The women of the 1950s did not know the science, but they kept doing it because the result, cleaner skin, better absorption of the cold cream that followed a slightly more luminous complexion in the days after, was real. They were not wrong about the outcome, they were only imprecise about the mechanism, and imprecision about mechanism is a very different thing from being wrong. There is something else about the facial steam ritual of this era that I do not think gets nearly enough attention, and it has less to do with dermatology than with something harder to quantify. 10 minutes under a towel face above a bowl of warm water is 10 minutes of enforced stillness. Your hands are free technically, but there is nothing useful you can do with them. You cannot look at your phone, both because it did not exist in 1952 and because the steam would ruin it if it did. You cannot read comfortably. You cannot attend to anything else. The towel over your head blocks the room. The steam fills your senses. The warmth relaxes the muscles around your eyes and jaw and forehead in a way that is frankly deeply pleasant. For 10 minutes twice a week you are simply there, present, breathing slowly, not attending to anything, not managing anything, not preparing for anything, just warm and still, and breathing steam that smells faintly of water. And sometimes, if you had added herbs to the bowl of chamomile or lavender or nothing in particular, I think about this sometimes when I read about the epidemic of stress and anxiety that characterizes our era, when researchers report that rates of chronic stress in the United States are at historic highs, when sleep doctors describe the damage done by the constant stimulation of our screens even in the hour before bed. The women of 1953 had their own stresses, enormous ones, and I do not want to suggest their lives were some kind of peaceful idyll. But they had this, twice a week, 10 minutes of warm, enforced, beautiful nothing, and they had it built into a beauty routine which meant it did not require any particular virtue or discipline to show up for. You were not meditating. You were not attending a wellness class. You were just doing your face. Except the doing of your face also incidentally happened to be good for your nervous system in ways that no one had yet developed the vocabulary to describe. The facial steam fell out of mainstream beauty culture somewhere in the 1970s and 80s. Several things converged to push it aside: the rise of exfoliating products and acid-based treatments that made steam seem redundant, the growing dermatological concern about heat and redness in certain skin conditions like rosacea, and I think most significantly the acceleration of the beauty routine itself. Steam takes time. Time became the one thing that 1980s beauty culture decided it did not have. But here is what is interesting. Certain corners of the skincare world have been quietly circling back. Estheticians who specialize in traditional methods have been recommending home steam facials with growing frequency. Korean skincare, which, as we noted with the double cleanse, has a talent for rediscovering things. The West forgot incorporated warm water and gentle steam preparation as a standard preliminary step. The at-home facial steamer device market, which barely existed in 2000, is now a several $100 million industry. The bowl still works just as well as any device. It always did. The woman in 1952 was not missing anything. For those with rosacea, severe inflammatory skin conditions, or broken capillaries, steam is genuinely something to approach with care or avoid altogether. Heat and redness are not friends when certain conditions are present, and the same vasodilation that gives healthy skin a lovely glow can aggravate skin that is already prone to inflammation. This is one of those areas where a consultation with a dermatologist is genuinely worth the conversation. The 1950s beauty guides were not written for all skin types equally, and this is one habit where individual skin sensitivity matters considerably. For everyone else, the evidence, both historical and scientific, is reasonably compelling. A bowl, some hot water, a towel, 5 to 10 minutes twice a week. What the skin gains is real. What the nervous system gains in that brief enforced stillness may be equally real and considerably harder to put a price on. We have now spent considerable time with the face, cleansing it, toning it, steaming it, attending to it with the kind of patient daily devotion that the 1950s beauty culture demanded. But there was another part of the body that this era paid unusually close attention to in ways that turn out to have their own quiet logic. Not the face, not the hair, something much more humble and much more revealing of a woman's character, according to every beauty guide published between 1945 and 1960. Her hands. The condition of a woman's hands in this era was understood to tell you something specific about how she lived, how she worked, and how much attention she paid to herself in the spaces between the visible public moments. The rituals built around maintaining hands in this decade, the creams, the oils, the cuticle care, the deliberate protection of something that was used constantly and exposed to everything, form one of the most unexpectedly modern chapters in the entire story of 1950s beauty. And that is exactly where we are headed next. Of all the beauty habits we've visited so far tonight, the one I am about to describe is perhaps the most quietly radical, not because it was unusual, but because of how completely ordinary it was, and how thoroughly we have abandoned it since. Every time she washed her hands, she applied cream afterward. Every single time. After washing dishes, after washing her face, after washing the children's clothes in the sink. She dried her hands, reached for the small pump bottle or jar that lived beside every sink in the house, and took 15 seconds, sometimes less, to rub a small amount of lotion into her palms and fingers. Then she went back to whatever she'd been doing. That is it. That is the whole ritual. And yet it produced something that women of this era had as a matter of course, and that we who spend considerably more money on skincare than they ever did often, do not genuinely well-maintained hands, soft at the knuckles, supple at the joints, not raw, not cracked, not the telltale sign of a hard-working body that has been asked to give everything and been offered nothing in return. The 1950s beauty guides did not treat hand care as a separate luxury category. They treated it as part of the minimum. The 1955 handbook we've returned to throughout this story listed hand lotion after washing up with the same matter-of-fact tone as brushing teeth. It was not optional. It was not self-indulgent. It was maintenance applied consistently many times a day to a part of the body that was working constantly and therefore needed constant attention. Why hands specifically? Why did this era place such weight on the condition of a woman's hands? Part of the answer is purely practical. Women in the 1950s were doing an enormous amount of manual labor that was invisible because it happened inside the home. Post-war America ran on the domestic labor of women, the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry done in increasingly available but still physically demanding machines, the dishes washed by hand twice a day, the floors scrubbed, the children bathed. All of this work was wet work, and wet work is specifically damaging to skin in a way that dry work is not. When skin is repeatedly soaked and dried, submerged in soapy water, exposed to detergent pulled back out into dry air, the skin barrier is repeatedly disrupted. The outer layer of skin depends on a careful balance of oils and water to maintain its structural integrity, and the constant wetting and drying cycle strips the oils faster than they can be replenished naturally. The result without intervention is chapping, cracking redness, and eventually the kind of roughened, thickened skin that becomes genuinely painful in cold weather. The women who applied hand cream multiple times a day were not being precious about their appearance. They were maintaining the functionality of tools they used constantly. Their hands were work instruments, and the cream was maintenance exactly as one might oil a good pair of leather gloves. The beauty aspect was real, but it was secondary to the simple practical logic of keeping skin intact and supple enough to do the work demanded of it. The second part of the answer involves something more cultural. In this era, the condition of a woman's hands was understood to be readable. Not in a judgmental way, at least not always, but in the way that well-maintained anything communicates something about the person who maintains it. Beautifully kept hands indicated attentiveness. They indicated a woman who had not surrendered every last ounce of herself to the demands around her, who had preserved some small portion of daily care for her own person. There was a kind of dignity signalled by soft, well-groomed hands that beauty guides of the era described with straightforward admiration. I find this genuinely complicated. On one hand, no pun intended, the pressure on women to maintain their appearance under all circumstances, including while performing exhausting domestic labour, was part of a larger cultural framework that asked enormous things of women and offered limited acknowledgement in return. On the other hand, the specific habit of hand cream after washing up is one of the most genuinely useful beauty practices that has ever existed, and we have abandoned it almost entirely. Those two things can both be true at once. Let us talk about what was actually in those hand creams, because this is where the history gets unexpectedly interesting, and science makes a guest appearance that will surprise you. The dominant moisturizing ingredients in 1950s hand creams were lanolin, glycerin and petrolatum, sometimes used separately, sometimes in combination. Lanolin is the one I want to linger on because its history is considerably stranger and more ancient than most people realize. Lanolin is a wax secreted by the sebaceous glands of sheep, specifically by the glands embedded in the skin beneath their wool. Its biological function is to protect the sheep's fleece and skin from rain and cold and environmental damage. Lanolin is what makes raw wool slightly water-resistant when you handle it. Shepherds and farmers have noticed for a very long time that their hands constantly exposed to raw wool, and therefore constantly in contact with lanolin, tended to be unusually soft. Soft in a specific way. Resilient in a specific way. The ancient Greeks were apparently paying attention. The Greek physician Dioscorides, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, documented a method for extracting what he called Wesopus wool fat from hot wool washing water, and described its applications for skin. Pliny the Elder, writing around the same era, described Roman military medicine, incorporating refined sheep wool fat in wound care. There is evidence from archaeological excavations at Roman military hospitals, including at the site of Vindolanda along Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, of ceramic vessels containing what analysis suggests was processed wool fat, sitting alongside other medical supplies. The Roman army was carrying a form of lanolin into battle. Whatever you want to say about the Romans, they were paying attention to things that worked. The modern refined form of lanolin, purified, bleached, deodorized and rendered stable for commercial use, was developed in 1882 by two German chemists named Otto Braun and Oskar Liebreich. They named their substance from the Latin words for wool and oil. Within decades, lanolin had become one of the most widely used ingredients in pharmacy and cosmetics. It found its way into ointments, lip products, baby creams and hand lotions, where it stayed largely unchallenged. Through the 1950s and beyond, what makes lanolin remarkable from a scientific standpoint is how well it behaves on human skin. Lanolin contains over 170 different fatty acids and esters, and its composition turns out to be genuinely similar to the lipid structure of human skin itself. This is not coincidence, it is chemistry doing what it does when two biological systems have evolved to solve similar problems. The sheep's skin needs to remain functional and supple under harsh conditions. So does human skin. The solution in both cases involves roughly similar molecules. Lanolin applied to human hands does not just sit on the surface like many moisturizers do. It is absorbed into the outer layers of the skin, where it supplements the skin's own lipid content and helps restore the barrier that wet work has repeatedly disrupted. Dermatologists today describe lanolin as one of the most effective natural emollients we have, with a long safety record and measurable skin barrier restoration properties. It has been briefly unfashionable in the 1990s. There was a period when lanolin got an undeserved reputation as an allergen based on studies that used impure, unrefined lanolin, but that reputation has largely been reassessed. Modern pharmaceutical-grade lanolin is well tolerated by the vast majority of people. The women who reach for their Jergens or their Nivea or their whatever was beside the sink in 1953 were getting a dose of one of the most skin-compatible moisturizing substances that exists. They just thought of it as hand cream. But the hand care of this era was not only about cream after washing. There were two other practices that appear consistently in beauty guides of the period, and both of them have their own quiet logic. The first is cuticle care. The 1955 handbook was specific: every morning after bathing, push back the cuticles, not cut them, push them. This distinction turns out to matter. The cuticle is a thin layer of tissue that seals the gap between the nail plate and the surrounding skin. It is not decorative. It is functional, a barrier against bacteria and moisture intrusion at what is actually a fairly vulnerable junction. Cutting cuticles aggressively, which became fashionable in later decades and is still common practice in many nail salons, removes that protective barrier and creates a small wound that is an entry point for infection. Dermatologists have been saying this for years. The recommendation to simply push the cuticle back gently after it's been softened by warm water rather than cutting it entirely is the more biologically sensible approach. The women following 1955 guidance were, on this point at least, ahead of the advice that followed them. Petroleum jelly applied to cuticles, nails, and the delicate skin around the nail bed was also standard practice. Constance Hart's handbook listed it as a nightly step applied at bedtime along with hand cream. The science here is essentially the same as its application elsewhere. Petroleum jelly is an extraordinarily effective occlusive barrier, preventing water loss from the skin by creating a physical seal. Nails themselves are made of keratin, and they require moisture to remain flexible rather than brittle. Repeated wetting and drying cycles dry out nails just as they dry out skin. A nightly application of petroleum jelly to the nail bed kept in place during sleep maintains nail hydration in a simple and effective way that costs by current standards almost nothing. The second practice was gloves. Rubber dishwashing gloves were available and were recommended consistently in beauty guides of the era for anyone doing sustained work in hot soapy water. But there was another kind of gloves that gets mentioned in the more intensive beauty routines of this period, and this one I find unexpectedly charming: thin cotton gloves worn at night after applying hand cream to hold the moisture against the skin during sleep. The overnight glove treatment is one of those things that sounds vaguely Victorian, that you might expect to encounter in a period drama rather than as practical beauty advice. But dermatologists still recommend it, not as a strange vintage eccentricity, as a genuinely effective treatment for severely dry hands, particularly in winter. When you apply a good emollient and then cover the skin to prevent evaporation, you allow the ingredients time to work without the moisture escaping into the air. The skin, given 6 or 8 uninterrupted hours of hydration under occlusion, can recover from even fairly significant dryness remarkably well. Women in 1953 doing their nightly hand cream, pushing back their cuticles, applying a little petroleum jelly to their nails, and occasionally pulling on a pair of thin cotton gloves before turning off the light they were running. What we would now call an intensive overnight hand treatment, available at their local drugstore for a few cents applied, with the casual efficiency of a habit so old it required no thought. Here is what I find genuinely moving about this chapter of the story, if I'm being honest. Hands are the part of the body that does the most work. They are almost always visible. They are the part most immediately affected by the labour of daily life, and the part most consistently overlooked in contemporary skincare culture, which is deeply focused on the face. We have elaborate routines for our faces. We have multi-step, multi-product, carefully sequenced rituals that cost more per month than some people spend on groceries. And then we wash the dishes with our bare hands and wonder why the skin on our knuckles looks like the surface of the moon. The women of the 1950s did not have better products. They did not have more money for their skincare. They had in many cases significantly less of both. What they had was a habit built into the architecture of daily life cream, after washing cream before bed gloves when necessary cuticles tended every morning as automatically as brushing teeth. The habit was the thing, not the product, not the sophistication of the formula. The simple, repeated, unthinking act of giving the hands something back after taking everything out of them. Have you looked at your hands recently? Really looked? Not in a critical way, just noticed them. What they carry, what they have done today, what they will do tomorrow. They are remarkable instruments. They deserve 15 seconds. We've spent a long time now with the more practical habits of this era. The cleansing, the toning, the brushing, the steaming, the hand cream applied at the kitchen sink. But there is a chapter of the 1950s beauty story that takes place in a different light entirely. Not morning light or kitchen light, but the soft, intimate light of the bedroom at night. When the face cream went on and stayed on, and the body was left to repair itself in the dark. The overnight beauty ritual of the 1950s was something specific, something deliberate, and something that modern sleep science and dermatology have a great deal to say about. It is the story of what the skin does when no one is looking, and how the women of this era, perhaps better than we do, arrange conditions for it to do that work well. That story starts right now. Sometime around 1953, a woman sitting at her vanity table completed the last step of her evening routine. She smoothed a thin film of emollient cream across her face, patted the delicate skin around her eyes. With something a little richer, pressed a small amount of petroleum jelly onto her lashes and brows, and then, and this is the detail I find quietly remarkable, she checked the bedroom. Not for intruders, not for anything alarming. She checked the bedroom the way the 1955 handbook instructed for proper sleeping conditions. Was the window cracked? Was the room cool enough? Was the pillow fresh, the blanket light enough not to overheat the curtains drawn against the early morning light? The handbook called these things practical prerequisites for genuine rest, not luxuries, requirements. Then she turned off the lamp, lay down, and let her skin do what it had been trying to do all day. What happened next in the dark in the hours between sleep and waking is something that scientists have spent decades working to understand. And what they found essentially is that the woman in 1953 was doing something more sophisticated than she knew. The phrase beauty sleep is one of those expressions so familiar that it has become almost meaningless. We use it lightly. I need my beauty sleep. Someone says half joking, reaching for another cup of coffee. But underneath the casual phrasing is a concept with genuine scientific weight, and its history goes back considerably further than you might expect. The idea that sleep restores the face, that there is a connection between the hours spent unconscious and the quality of the skin in daylight, appears in beauty literature from at least the 18th century. By the 19th century, it was common advice in women's magazines to treat sleep as a deliberate beauty strategy, not merely as rest. By the 1950s, it had become embedded in the practical architecture of daily life in ways that our era, despite knowing considerably more about sleep science, has largely abandoned. Here is what the science actually shows, and it is not nothing. During deep sleep, specifically during the slow-wave stages of sleep that occur in the earlier part of the night, the body releases the majority of its daily growth hormone. This is not a minor biochemical footnote. Growth hormone is the primary signal that instructs skin cells to regenerate, to synthesize collagen, to repair the accumulated environmental damage of the day. Without adequate deep sleep, growth hormone release is suppressed, collagen synthesis slows, and the skin's ability to restore itself is compromised in ways that accumulate over time, compounding visibly over months and years. Studies published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism have confirmed that the majority of daily growth hormone secretion occurs during sleep, particularly in those early deep sleep stages that are most easily disrupted by irregular sleep patterns, late nights, and a detail that becomes relevant shortly artificial light exposure before bed. Simultaneously, cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, drops during sleep. This matters because cortisol, when chronically elevated, breaks down collagen, and elastin, the structural proteins that keep skin firm and resilient. It also drives inflammation, which worsens a wide range of skin conditions. The decline in cortisol during sleep is the body's nightly opportunity to let inflammation subside and repair begin. Chronic poor sleep means chronically elevated cortisol, which means chronically impaired repair. One study that examined the relationship between sleep quality and visible skin aging found that good sleepers showed approximately 30% greater barrier recovery after skin stress compared to poor sleepers. That is not a small number. That is a meaningful difference in how quickly and completely the skin bounces back from daily damage. The skin also increases its permeability during sleep. Transepidermal water loss, the rate at which water evaporates from the skin's surface, rises in the evening hours, which creates a paradox. The skin is simultaneously more vulnerable to moisture loss and more receptive to whatever you have applied before bed. The outermost layers of the skin become more permeable, meaning that the emollient cream the woman in 1953 smoothed onto her face before sleeping was not just sitting on the surface. It was being absorbed into those outer layers more efficiently than it would have been during the day, working with the skin's natural nighttime chemistry rather than against it. The women who applied cream before bed and left it on overnight were doing something that modern dermatologists now describe as optimizing the skin's natural repair window. They did not have the vocabulary. They had the habit. But the science of what happened to the skin during sleep is only half of this story. The other half is what the women of the 1950s understood, and we seem to have largely forgotten about the conditions required for sleep itself. The 1955 handbook's instruction to check the bedroom before getting into bed was not fussiness. It was attentiveness to a set of environmental factors that turn out to matter considerably for sleep quality, and through sleep quality for everything the skin does in the dark. Temperature is the clearest example. The body needs to drop its core temperature by roughly 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit in order to initiate and sustain the deep sleep stages, where growth hormone release and skin repair are most active. A bedroom that is too warm interferes with this process. It reduces the proportion of slow-wave sleep, reduces growth hormone release, and effectively shortens the period during which the skin is doing its most productive work. The beauty guides of the 1950s consistently recommended a cool room, a light blanket, and cracked windows even in winter. This was not eccentricity. It was intuitive wisdom about conditions for quality sleep that sleep scientists would spend the following decades working to prove. Darkness is another. The discovery of rapid eye movement sleep was made in 1953, the same year our imagined woman is sitting at her vanity table, by researchers Nathaniel Kleitman and Eugene Aserinsky at the University of Chicago. That discovery opened up the entire science of sleep stages. What followed over the subsequent decades was a growing understanding of how light exposure regulates melatonin production, how melatonin governs the timing of sleep onset and sleep depth, and how disrupting that process disrupts everything downstream. The bedroom curtains drawn against early morning light, the lamp turned off before lying down. These were not incidental habits. They were melatonin management practiced without anyone having yet coined that phrase. And then there is consistency. The same beauty guides that prescribed the nighttime routine also prescribed a consistent bedtime. Not as a rigid rule for its own sake, but from the intuitive understanding that the body works best on a predictable schedule. The skin's circadian rhythm, its internal clock that determines when it shifts from defense mode into repair mode, is synchronized with the body's overall sleep-wake cycle. When that cycle is consistent, the repair window opens reliably and efficiently. When it's disrupted by irregular schedules, late nights, and the kind of fragmented phone-adjacent sleep that characterizes our era, the skin's internal clock becomes confused. its repair efficiency drops, and the cumulative effect shows up gradually persistently on the face. There is a particular detail from the 1955 handbook that I have thought about many times and that I want to share because it strikes me as quietly profound. Among the final steps of the bedtime routine after the cream had been applied and the bedroom had been checked, the handbook suggested apply a touch of perfume or cologne below the nostrils for easier sleeping. For easier sleeping, not for attractiveness, not to smell nice for a partner, for easier sleeping. Because the author understood something that aromatherapy research has since produced evidence for, that certain scents experienced as the body transitions towards sleep can modulate the nervous system in ways that ease the transition into rest. The specific biochemical mechanisms are complex, but the general finding that scent, particularly calm and familiar scent, can reduce cortisol and support relaxation has been replicated across multiple studies. Lavender is the most studied in contemporary research, but the principle that scent and sleep are connected was being applied practically and without any laboratory to back it up in 1955. I find that extraordinary. Not because it is a stunning scientific discovery, but because it suggests that the women writing and following these guides were paying attention with genuine fineness to the conditions that produced well-rested, well-maintained skin. They were observing their own experience carefully enough to know that scent mattered at bedtime, that temperature mattered, that the quality of sleep was not separate from the quality of the skin, that the two were part of the same system, and the system needed to be understood as a whole. Something else embedded in the overnight routine of this era deserves mention, because it connects to a question you may already be asking. Did all of this, the cream, the petroleum jelly on the lashes, the emollient around the eyes, did it actually do what was claimed? The honest answer is mostly yes, with caveats. The emollient cream left on overnight reduced transepidermal water loss during the hours when the skin was most vulnerable to losing moisture. It did not perform miracles. It did not reverse aging. It did not replace the cellular level repair that sleep itself was accomplishing. But it created conditions, a physical barrier against overnight moisture evaporation, supplemental lipids, for the skin barrier that made the skin's own repair work more efficient. Good sleepers with moisturized skin showed better barrier recovery than good sleepers with unmoisturized skin. The cream was not the hero of this story. Sleep was. But the cream was a useful supporting character. The petroleum jelly on lashes and brows, which we encountered earlier in the context of hand care, served a similar function. Lashes, like nails, are largely composed of keratin and require moisture to remain flexible and resilient. The repeated application of mascara curling and environmental exposure throughout the day left lashes dry by evening. A small amount of petroleum jelly overnight, creating an occlusive seal that held moisture in the lash structure, was simple, inexpensive, and effective in ways that castor oil lash serums at modern spa prices have since confirmed by marketing the same principle back to us at a considerable markup. The emollient cream around the eyes, the particular attention to that delicate area was sound practice. The skin around the eyes is the thinnest on the face, has fewer sebaceous glands than skin elsewhere, and loses moisture most rapidly. In the hierarchy of where overnight moisture support matters most, the eye area ranks consistently near the top. Women in the 1950s who applied a little extra emollient there before bed were showing a sophistication about skin anatomy that their language did not formally encode, but their practice clearly reflected. What I keep returning to thinking about this chapter of the story is a kind of proportion that our era has almost entirely lost. The women of the 1950s understood, sometimes consciously, sometimes by inheritance, that skin is not just a surface, it is a system. It has its own rhythms, its own windows of activity and repair, its own requirements for conditions that allow it to function well. And they structured their days and nights around those rhythms with a consistency that we, despite knowing considerably more, have largely stopped practicing. We know that sleep repairs the skin. We know that overnight moisture matters. We know that cortisol damages collagen, and that growth hormone rebuilds it, and that both of those processes are governed by the quality of sleep we get. We know this. We have the studies. We have the science. And then we scroll for another 45 minutes in the blue light of our screens, disrupting our melatonin, fragmenting our sleep stages, shortening the window when our skin most wants to heal, and wonder why the expensive cream is not doing more. The woman in 1953 did not have the expensive cream. She had the habit, and she had the sleep. From the quiet hours of the bedroom, we move now into territory that is harder to discuss with the same gentleness. Because this next chapter is where the beauty culture of the 1950s begins to show its seams. We have spent time with the habits that worked and worked well, and that deserve a second look in our own lives. But the next chapter is about the habits that appeared to be beauty practices and were underneath the surface something considerably more complicated. It is about lipstick. Not as glamour, but as disciplined performance, and a set of unspoken social demands about what a woman was supposed to signal with her face every single time she stepped into the world. The story of the 1950s lipstick is about much more than colour, and it starts right after this. Let me tell you about a statistic that stopped me cold when I first came across it. In the early 1950s, surveys of American women found that 98% of them wore lipstick regularly. 98%. At the same time, roughly 96% of American women reported brushing their teeth daily, which means that in the United States of America circa 1952, a woman was statistically more likely to put on lipstick than to brush her teeth. I want to sit with that number for a moment because it contains an entire world view. It tells you something very specific about what women of that era understood themselves to owe the world, or more precisely what the world had taught them they owed it. The story of lipstick in the 1950s is not at its surface a beauty story at all. It is a story about obligation about the body as a site of social performance, and about how a tube of coloured wax managed to carry the weight of an entire cultural negotiation about what it meant to be a woman in post-war America. But it is also, and this is what makes it genuinely complicated, the story of something that women fought for, claimed as their own, and sometimes refused to give up even when the world told them they should. The lipstick of the 1950s held both of those things at once, and you cannot understand it without holding both. So let us start at the beginning. And the beginning is not the 1950s at all. Lipstick has one of the most politically charged histories in the entire archive of human cosmetics. In ancient Greece, women of certain social classes were legally required to wear identifiable lip paint, not as adornment, but as a mark of status. In medieval Europe, the Church associated red lips with vanity and moral corruption. By the 19th century, the association between painted lips and disreputable character was so entrenched in Anglo-American culture that respectable women largely avoided visible lip colour entirely. What broke this open was the suffragette movement. In 1912, leaders of the women's suffrage movement in the United States, including figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Charlotte Perkins Gilman, wore red lipstick to their marches explicitly as an act of defiance. The choice was deliberate. Red lipstick had been coded as transgressive, as belonging to women who stepped outside the boundaries of respectable femininity. The suffragettes wore it precisely because of that coding. They were claiming the right to occupy public space with painted, visible, unapologetic faces. Red lipstick became a small, vivid flag for a much larger argument. That association lipstick as defiance, as self-assertion, as refusal to be invisible survived into the Second World War in a form that is genuinely extraordinary. Adolf Hitler, among his many documented peculiarities, had a strong personal distaste for cosmetics. The Nazi ideal of femininity was deliberately coded against the modern made-up woman. German women were to be plain restrained without the artifice of rouge or painted lips. The broader propaganda machine actively discouraged cosmetics as vain, frivolous, inappropriate for the serious work of the nation. When the occupied territories of Europe and the resisting populations of Allied nations became aware of this, something interesting happened. Women began wearing red lipstick as a quiet, persistent, very visible form of defiance. In the munitions factories of Britain, management distributed tubes of red lipstick to workers as a morale tool, understanding correctly that the act of putting on lipstick was itself a statement of unconquered femininity, a refusal to let the war strip away every last element of personal identity. The United States Marine Corps Women's Reserve was issued Elizabeth Arden's lipstick in a specific shade called Montezuma Red, formulated to match the red trim on their uniforms. The United States government was commissioning lipstick colours for its female troops. That is a sentence I do not think I will ever stop finding remarkable. So when the war ended and the women of America found themselves in the suburb and the kitchen and the beauty culture of the 1950s, they were arriving with a historical relationship to lipstick that carried considerably more than vanity. They carried lipstick as something that had been fought for, that had been worn in defiance of oppression, that had been in a particular and strange sense a form of freedom. And then the 1950s turned it into something else. By 1951, a survey found that 2/3 of American teenage girls wore lipstick. By 1952, Revlon's now famous Fire and Ice advertising campaign, a 2-page spread featuring model Dorian Lee in a striking crimson shade accompanied by a 15-question quiz asking readers whether their personality was bold enough to wear it, had become one of the most successful cosmetics campaigns in history. "Have you ever danced with your shoes off?" the quiz asked. "Do you think any man really understands you?" These were not questions about lipstick. They were questions about whether a woman was interesting enough to deserve it. The lipstick market was in a state of genuine commercial warfare. In 1950, a chemist named Hazel Bishop, a woman, it is worth noting, working in a field almost entirely dominated by men, launched a company to sell her invention, a long-lasting non-smearing lipstick she called No Smear. The tagline was brilliantly simple: "It stays on you, not on him." Sales in 1950 were $49,000. By 1953 they had reached $10 million. Revlon, watching in alarm, rushed their own version to market. Coty followed. The lipstick wars, as the trade press called them, consumed the better part of the mid-decade, with brands suing each other over the word indelible and regulators weighing in on what could legally be claimed. All of this commercial frenzy was being conducted over a product that 98% of American women were already buying. Which tells you something about how much money was at stake, and something about how thoroughly lipstick had embedded itself into the daily life of the American woman, not as luxury but as requirement. This is the complication I want to spend some time with, because it sits at the heart of what the lipstick habit of this era really was. Air hostesses, the term then in use, were contractually required to wear lipstick. Some secretarial positions specified it in job descriptions. The cultural expectation was close to universal. A woman appearing in public without lipstick was, in the social language of the time, not quite properly dressed. She had not finished. She had not attended to what was owed. And what was owed was a particular face. Not your own face exactly, but a version of it that signalled engagement with femininity as a performance lipstick, as the minimum required contribution to the theatre of appearing female in public in 1953. Going out without it was a kind of social nudity, not dramatic, not indecent, but noticed, commented upon, a subtle breach of the unwritten contract that women of this era were asked to maintain with the world around them. Now here is where I want to be very careful. because this is a subject where nuance matters more than usual. The pressure was real, the expectation was real. And for many women, particularly those who found the demands of post-war feminine performance exhausting and limiting and unfair, which many did quietly, and sometimes not so quietly. Lipstick was part of the scaffolding of a role they had not chosen and could not easily refuse. That is true, and it is important. But simultaneously and just as truly, many women of this era loved their lipstick. They chose their shades with genuine pleasure. They had opinions about whether coral suited them better than crimson, whether pink felt too girlish for their age, whether the new pastels of the late 1950s were an improvement or a betrayal of everything good about red. The relationship between the women of this era and their lipstick was not simply the relationship of the coerced to the requirement. It was personal, it was aesthetic, it was sometimes joyful. And occasionally, this is the detail I find most human of all, it was stubborn. Have you ever heard of a woman in the 1950s refusing to leave the house without her lipstick? Not because the world required it of her, but because she required it of herself. Not as performance for others, but as a kind of private armor, a small act of self-completion that preceded everything else. That particular relationship to lipstick, where the color applied in a 30-second ritual at the bathroom mirror became a gesture toward one's own sense of being put together, of being ready, that did not disappear when the feminist movements of the 1960s began to dismantle the mandatory nature of feminine performance. It just became quieter, more personal, less loaded. Because the thing about the blot and layer technique that women of this era practiced, and it was a technique with genuine craft to it, is that it was not a simple act. Applying lipstick the way the beauty guides of 1953 recommended was a 5-step process. First coat pressed together and blotted with a tissue. Second coat applied, pressed and blotted again. A dusting of powder between coats to set the stain. Then a final coat blotted once more. The entire sequence took perhaps 90 seconds if you were practiced. But those 90 seconds produced a result that lasted through the demands of a full day in ways that a single swipe of the tube did not. The color went on in layers, each one sealed before the next was added, building a depth of pigment that adhered to the lip surface rather than sitting on top of it. The technique was derived from the same principle that professional painters use when building color on canvas. Multiple thin layers produce both richer color and greater durability than a single thick application. Applied to lips with a light hand and careful blotting, it worked. The women who did it daily knew it worked because they had done it 1,000 times and watched the difference. And then there was Hazel Bishop herself, a detail I keep returning to, because it reframes the entire commercial story. Here was a woman with a chemistry degree working in a male-dominated industry who spent years developing a lipstick formula that genuinely performed better than anything currently on the market. She used bromo acid dyes that stained the lips rather than merely coating them, combined with pigments that adhered more tenaciously to the lip surface than conventional formulas. Her company grew from $49,000 in sales to $10 million in 3 years entirely through the quality of the product and the brilliance of its marketing. And then through a set of complex business and legal circumstances, she lost control of the company that bore her name. Revlon and its larger resources overwhelmed her. By the mid-1950s, Hazel Bishop Inc. was no longer run by Hazel Bishop. She went on to become a financial analyst and then an academic who taught the business of cosmetics at Fordham University. She was, by any measure, one of the most interesting scientific and entrepreneurial figures in the post-war American beauty industry. And most people reading this have never heard her name. What remains of all this for us? The blotting technique still works. Multiple thin coats still build better color than one thick application. The principle of layering is sound cosmetic chemistry, and it costs nothing beyond an extra minute and a tissue. Contemporary makeup artists use exactly this method for shoots, where lipstick needs to survive hours without reapplication. The woman in 1953 who stood at her mirror working through 5 careful steps before leaving the house was on this particular point, practicing something technically sophisticated that has survived into the present without requiring a single update. The obligation is gone, or at least loosened considerably. We live in an era where the decision to wear lipstick or not is understood, at least in principle, as a personal choice rather than a social requirement. Whether practice has fully caught up to principle is a more complicated question. But the formal contractual expectation that made lipstick effectively mandatory for American women in 1953 has been dismantled, and that dismantling was genuinely necessary. What I find beautiful in looking at this history is the way the lipstick managed to carry so many contradictions simultaneously. It was a requirement and a pleasure, a performance and a private ritual, a symbol of defiance and a tool of conformity, a small act of chemistry and a large act of culture. It was in this era never just lipstick. We've now moved through most of the beauty cabinet of the 1950s, the creams and toners, the brushes and steam, the hand lotions and overnight rituals, and that complicated tube of pigment that carried the weight of an entire cultural conversation. What remains is something we have been circling since the very beginning of tonight's story, the beauty habits of this era, that were not just ineffective, but genuinely harmful. The products that caused real damage, the standards that had real costs. It is time to open that chapter, and it is not a comfortable one, but it is necessary if we're going to be honest about what the 1950s actually meant for the bodies of the women who lived in it. The part of this story I've been both dreading and waiting to tell you is this one, not because it is the most dramatic, not because the individual facts are the hardest to sit with, though some of them are quite difficult to hear, but because it requires us to hold 2 things in tension: simultaneously genuine affection for the ingenuity and care that ran through the beauty culture of the 1950s, and a completely honest accounting of what that same culture was also doing to the bodies of the women who lived inside it. We have spent a long time together celebrating the cold cream and the boar bristle brush, and the 10 minutes of steam, and the hand lotion applied beside the kitchen sink. Those things deserved celebration. They worked, or most of them did, and they carried a philosophy of consistent self-care that our era could genuinely benefit from recovering. But the 1950s beauty cabinet also contained other things that were not wellness rituals in disguise, things that caused real, documented, sometimes irreversible harm, and the women using them often knew, or half knew or suspected, and used them anyway, because the pressure to look a particular way was powerful enough to make that calculation feel rational. Let us be honest about that pressure first before we open the cabinet. The ideal of beauty in 1950s America was not merely an aesthetic preference, it was a specification, and the specification was extraordinarily narrow. The face that advertising Hollywood and the popular press held up as the standard in this era was white. It was young, always young. It was smooth-skinned in a particular way. The skin of someone who had never worked outdoors, never sat in the sun longer than necessary, never been marked by the kind of exposure that comes with a life of physical labor. It was thin in the face in a particular way. It was in the precise sense of the word, a specific type of face, and the overwhelming majority of American women did not have it. This is not a small observation. The American population in 1952 included millions of women of African, Asian, Latin American and indigenous descent women, whose beauty the mainstream culture of the time either ignored entirely or actively pathologized. The beauty guides we've been exploring throughout this story, Constance Hart's handbook, the magazine columns, the educational films were written for white women, assumed white readers, and described beauty practices calibrated to white skin. Women who did not fit that template were not simply excluded from the cultural conversation about beauty. They were often told explicitly and commercially that their natural appearance was a problem to be corrected. The products sold to correct that problem were sometimes poisonous. Skin lightening creams were a significant category of the 1940s and 1950s beauty market, marketed with euphemisms, complexion perfectors, freckle removers, skin refiners, that obscured what they actually promised: a chemical alteration of the skin's natural melanin production. Some of these products were benign, or at least not actively harmful. Many were not. The most dangerous formulations used mercury compounds, specifically mercurous chloride and mercuric chloride, as their active ingredient. Mercury disrupts the enzyme processes that produce melanin in the skin, which does cause the skin to lighten. It also accumulates in the body. Mercury is a neurotoxin. It does not leave. As exposure continues, the symptoms accumulate: tremors, memory loss, kidney damage, mood changes, loss of peripheral vision, difficulty walking. One woman, described in an FDA case report from the 1930s, developed dark rings around her eyes and neck, bluish-black gums and loose teeth after years of using a popular complexion cream called Gourod's Oriental Cream. She was suffering mercury poisoning. The cream had been on the American market for decades. The 1938 Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, the legislation that fundamentally restructured the federal government's ability to regulate beauty products, was passed largely in response to a series of disasters that had made the absence of cosmetic regulation impossible to ignore. Among the exhibits assembled to build political support for that legislation was a travelling display organised by Ruth DeForest Lamb, the Chief Education Officer of the Food and Drug Administration, called the Chamber of Horrors. It documented the human cost of unregulated cosmetics with photographs and case studies that Eleanor Roosevelt reportedly found so distressing that she pressed them to her chest and turned away. But the 1938 Act, significant as it was, did not eliminate mercury from skin lightening products. The United States Food and Drug Administration did not formally ban mercury from cosmetics at concentrations above 1 part per million until 1973. Which means that throughout the 1950s, throughout the entire decade, we've been exploring mercury-containing skin lighteners were legally available on American shelves. Women who used them regularly were slowly accumulating a heavy metal in their bodies that has no safe threshold, and they were doing so in response to a cultural standard that told them their natural skin color was inadequate. That is the full picture, not just the harm of the product, but the harm of the system that made the product feel necessary. Mercury was not the only poison on the shelf, and the history of dangerous cosmetics is considerably older than the 1950s, which provides a context worth understanding, not to excuse what happened in this era, but to recognize that the 1950s were not uniquely reckless. They were the inheritors of a very long tradition of beauty products that caused genuine damage, and the story of how regulation gradually caught up with that tradition is one of the more compelling narratives in the history of public health. Consider what came before. In the 16th century, fashionable European women used a face powder called Venetian ceruse, a white lead preparation that created the pale, smooth complexion that was the ideal of the era. Lead absorbed through the skin causes neurological damage, kidney damage, hair loss, and ultimately insufficient concentration death. Several historians have speculated that Queen Elizabeth I of England, whose notoriously thick white face powder was applied over skin already damaged by a smallpox outbreak, may have experienced lead poisoning in her later years. Maria Coventry, Countess of Coventry, an 18th century British socialite famous for her beauty, died in 1760 and was widely believed to have been killed by her heavy use of ceruse, death by complexion product, in the most literal possible sense. In the 19th century, American drugstores sold preparations containing arsenic for complexion improvement. The arsenic caused the skin to appear pale and transparent, exactly the consumptive, delicate look that Victorian aesthetics prized. The fact that this paleness was produced by the arsenic-destroying red blood cells was not apparently a significant marketing obstacle. "Absolutely harmless," said the advertisements. The 1930s produced one of the most dramatic cautionary tales in the history of dangerous cosmetics, and it happened to concern not skin lightening but hair removal. A chemist named Cora Lubin created a depilatory cream called Coremlu, the name derived from her own name, and marketed it as a permanent, safe solution to unwanted hair. The active ingredient was thallium acetate. Thallium is rat poison. Within a year of the product's launch in 1930, hospitals across the country were treating patients presenting with what the Journal of the American Medical Association described as viciously dangerous symptoms, excruciating abdominal pain, the sensation of walking on burning coals, complete hair loss, and progressive neurological damage. One 26-year-old woman lost her teeth, her eyesight, and her ability to walk. By 1932, the company had filed for bankruptcy under the weight of $2.5 million in damage suits. The thing that strikes me about the Coremlu case and about many of these cases is that neither the manufacturer nor the regulatory system that allowed the product to market knew initially what was happening. The harm accumulated gradually in the bodies of women who did not connect their worsening symptoms to the cream they had been using for months. The mechanism of the damage was not immediately obvious. This is the particular cruelty of toxins that accumulate slowly. By the time the pattern becomes visible, significant harm has already been done. By the 1950s, the worst of the pre-regulation era was technically over. The 1938 Act had established that the government could intervene when cosmetics caused harm, and the most egregiously toxic products of the earlier decades were no longer on shelves. But no longer the worst is a very different thing from safe. The skin-lightening creams with mercury were still available. Certain hair dyes of the era contained coal tar derivatives that had documented carcinogenic potential and were only partially regulated. The pressure on women to achieve a specific look through whatever chemical means happened to be available remained enormous, and the women most vulnerable to the most harmful products were consistently the women who had the fewest options. Women of colour targeted by skin-lightening marketing. Women without the education or access to information that might have helped them evaluate what they were putting on their skin. Women who were told by every major cultural institution that their appearance was a problem and then offered a solution that would damage them. The Doll test conducted in 1939 by psychologists Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark, which showed African American children between the ages of 6 and 9 preferring a white doll over a black doll, and describing the black doll as bad, was used as evidence in the 1954 Supreme Court case that desegregated American public schools. The argument was that segregation caused psychological harm to black children by teaching them to internalize a hierarchy of worth based on skin color. The same hierarchy was being actively marketed in beauty products throughout the 1950s. The psychological evidence was strong enough to help change the law. The marketing continued regardless. I want to pause here for a moment and acknowledge something. This chapter of the story is uncomfortable to sit with precisely because it requires holding the beauty culture of the 1950s in both hands at once, with genuine appreciation and genuine criticism simultaneously, without resolving the tension into something neater. The cold cream ritual was real and it worked. The petroleum jelly on the lashes was gentle and effective. The steam bath was soothing and scientifically defensible. And the same culture that produced those things also produced mercury-laden skin lighteners marketed to women who had been taught to find their own appearance inadequate. These are not contradictions that can be resolved. They are the actual complexity of a historical moment, and the only honest response is to hold that complexity, rather than flattening it into a lesson that is easier to carry. What I hope you take from this chapter is not simply, some things from the past were bad, that is too easy, too available as a conclusion. What I hope you take is a slightly sharper attentiveness to the relationship between beauty standards and beauty products in your own era. The mechanism has not fundamentally changed. The specific substances are different. The regulatory framework is stronger. The explicit racial coding is less overt, but the basic dynamic, in which a narrow cultural ideal creates demand for products that promise to close the gap, and some of those products cause harm in the process, is still very much with us. It is worth staying curious about. It is worth asking when we encounter a product that promises to correct something about our appearance, who decided that thing needed correcting, and what assumptions sit underneath that decision. We have almost reached the end of tonight's journey through the beauty cabinet of 1953. 2 chapters remain, and both of them are in their different ways about wholeness, about what happens when you step back from the individual habits and the individual products and ask a larger question. The next one is a question about posture and breath, and the surprising body practices that the beauty guides of this era treated as inseparable from the skincare and the makeup and the hand cream. Because the women of the 1950s understood something that our era's separation of wellness from beauty has obscured the body as one system, and you cannot take genuinely good care of the surface without attending to what is happening underneath it. That is a more interesting argument than it might initially sound, and it is exactly where we are going next. Among all the instructions in Constance Hart's 1955 handbook, the one that strikes most modern readers as the most quaint, the one most likely to provoke a small affectionate laugh, is this: consciously practice better sitting, standing, and walking posture. At least once during the day, check your posture in a full-length mirror. Deliberately take 20 deep breaths 3 times during the day. 20 deep breaths, 3 times a day. Written into a beauty guide between the advice about hand cream and the instructions for checking the bedroom before sleep, as though it were as obvious a component of a woman's appearance as her lipstick. We smile at this because it seems so charmingly earnest, so physiologically optimistic, so wonderfully mid-century in its faith that behavior repeated consciously produces visible results. And then a researcher publishes a study showing that forward head posture restricts lymphatic drainage in the face, leading to puffiness and under-eye bags. And another one confirms that individuals who maintained an upright posture during stressful tasks showed measurably lower cortisol levels than those who slouched. And the McMaster University study finds that people who do at least 30 minutes of moderate cardio twice weekly have significantly thicker, healthier skin layers than sedentary participants without any additional skincare products. And you stop smiling, because the handbook was right. The connection between physical movement, breathing, and skin health is one of those subjects that inhabits an awkward middle ground in contemporary culture. It is too ordinary to be exciting. Everyone knows you're supposed to exercise. Everyone knows you should breathe better. No one needs a beauty guide to tell them this. And yet the specific mechanism by which a daily morning stretch, or 3 rounds of deep breathing, or a straight spine during the afternoon hours actually shows up on the face, that part tends to get lost. We know the headline. We rarely understand the biology underneath it. Let me try to connect those for a moment, because the women of the 1950s who stretched in front of an open window and stood at a full-length mirror to check their posture were doing something that was far more consequential than it looked. When you slouch, and if you are reading this on a phone or laptop, there is a statistically reasonable chance that you are slouching right now. Several things happen that directly affect your skin. The muscles of the neck and shoulders tighten. That tightening restricts blood flow upward toward the face, meaning less oxygen and fewer nutrients reach the skin cells. Simultaneously, it slows the lymphatic drainage of the face. The lymphatic system, which clears metabolic waste and excess fluid, has no pump of its own and depends entirely on movement and muscle contraction to flow. When the neck is compressed and the shoulders round forward, that drainage slows. Fluid pools. The face appears puffy, particularly under the eyes. The skin looks dull because its supply of oxygen and nutrients has been throttled by the same tension that is giving you a headache. This is not a marginal effect. Physiotherapists who work with clients on posture correction report seeing visible changes in facial appearance, reduced puffiness, improved skin tone, greater definition along the jaw, that they attribute directly to improved circulation and lymphatic flow. These are changes produced not by any product, not by any procedure, but by the simple act of holding the body differently. A beauty guide written in 1955 in the language of its era described this relationship between body and face through the lens of looking your best. We would describe it today through the lens of physiology. But the observation underlying both descriptions is the same. The daily stretch that opened the 1955 morning routine 10 stretches while still in bed, then 10 more standing at the open window, was the first act of the day before coffee, before face cream, before anything else. The logic behind putting it first was intuitive rather than scientific, but it turns out to be sound. During sleep, the body is relatively still for 7 or 8 hours. Circulation slows. The lymphatic system, which clears the face of overnight fluid accumulation, has been operating at low capacity. The morning puffiness that many people experience, slightly swollen eyes, a face that looks fuller and less defined than it will an hour later, is largely the result of that overnight fluid pooling in the absence of movement. The stretch and the standing at an open window were, in physiological terms, a gentle pump. They activated the muscles which activated the lymphatic system which began clearing the face of excess fluid. Movement first, everything else after. There is also the breathing at the open window, which the handbook specified as part of the morning sequence. Open window breathing in the morning, cool fresh air, ideally before the central heating had dried out. The room was understood in this era as invigorating as a kind of physical reset after the relative stillness of sleep. Modern research on diaphragmatic breathing that fully engages the diaphragm rather than the shallow chest breathing. Most people default to under stress confirms that it measurably reduces cortisol, increases the antioxidant activity of cells, and activates what physiologists call the parasympathetic nervous system, the branch of the nervous system responsible for repair, restoration, and calm. The opposite of the fight or flight response, the state in which the body does its best healing work. 20 deep breaths 3 times a day. That is not a beauty tip. That is a cortisol management strategy disguised as a beauty tip. And cortisol, as we have established, is the hormone that breaks down collagen, which means that 60 conscious breaths distributed across the day are in a very real sense an anti-aging practice that predates the entire concept of anti-aging skincare by about half a century. Jack LaLanne's television show launched in 1951 on a local San Francisco station and became over the following decade one of the most watched programs in American morning television. By the time it entered national syndication in 1959, LaLanne was exercising in front of the camera for 30 minutes every weekday, telling the housewives of America that their bodies were capable of more than they had been led to believe. LaLanne was a genuinely radical figure in this context, though he tends not to be recognized as such. He was telling women in the 1950s at a moment when exercise was considered vaguely masculine, when physical exertion was not widely recommended for women, when the ideal of feminine beauty was sedentary by design, that strength and movement were not just acceptable, but beautiful. That the body was a system that rewarded care. That the face on the outside was a reflection of the health on the inside. He was also by most accounts quite entertaining. He would do things on camera like perform more than 1,000 push-ups in 23 minutes, simply to demonstrate what a trained body could accomplish. He was not subtle. But the message underneath the showmanship was ahead of his time. You cannot take good care of the surface without taking care of what is underneath it. The morning exercise that beauty guides of this era recommended 5 minutes of calisthenic stretching simple movement was not designed to produce visible muscles. It was designed to wake the body up to get blood moving to start the day in a state of physical engagement rather than physical inertia. That 5 minutes of movement in the morning produced better circulation to the face and scalp for the rest of the day. It lowered the cortisol that would otherwise be elevated by the stress of a day that had not yet properly begun. Now, and I want to ask you this directly, when was the last time you stood at a window in the morning and took 10 long, slow, deliberate breaths before doing anything else? Not while looking at your phone, not while running through your to-do list. Just standing at a window maybe with a hand on the glass, feeling the coolness and breathing in and out 10 times with enough intention to actually feel it. I ask because this is the habit that strikes me as most thoroughly lost. Not the cold cream, not the steam bath, not the cuticle oil, all of which require specific products or conditions or time. This one requires nothing, literally nothing. You need air and a window and 20 seconds of willingness to stand still and breathe. And the woman in 1955 who did it every morning was not engaging in a spiritual practice. She was not meditating. She was not doing breath work in any formal sense. She was not following a wellness protocol. She was just breathing at the window because the handbook told her to, and because it made her feel better, and because the day seemed clearer and steadier after she had done it. There is something I find genuinely moving about the specific instruction to check your posture in a full-length mirror once a day, not obsessively, not with the harsh self-appraisal that beauty culture often encourages. Once. A single, deliberate look with the specific intention of noticing how you are holding yourself and making an adjustment. What this instruction was building, practiced daily, was body awareness. The capacity to notice without judgment when the shoulders have crept up toward the ears, when the chin has pushed forward, when the spine is carrying the weight of the afternoon in its compressed curve. The mirror was not a tool for finding flaws, it was a tool for recalibration, a 30-second reality check that asked the body to remember what upright felt like, and then to return to it. We live in an era of unprecedented body awareness. In some respects, there is more information available about posture movement and physical health than at any point in history. And yet the average person sits for roughly 9 to 11 hours a day in positions that restrict circulation, compress the spine, and tighten the muscles of the neck and shoulders in ways that affect the face as directly as any cream we might apply to it. We have the knowledge. We have not built the habit. The woman who checked her posture in the mirror every afternoon did not know about lymphatic drainage. She did not know that forward head posture was strangling the flow of nutrients to her skin cells. She knew that she felt better when she stood tall, that her clothes looked better on her, that she moved through the world with more ease. That was enough. The body gave her the feedback and she listened to it, and the feedback turned out to be correct. Breathing posture, morning movement. These were woven into the beauty guides of the 1950s not as separate wellness categories, but as components of the same project. The project was the maintenance of a self, not for its own sake, and not without the pressures and contradictions we've been honest about throughout this story, but also not without genuine wisdom about what it means to inhabit a body well. Health was beauty in this era in a way that our era, which has separated wellness and beauty into distinct and sometimes competing industries, has partially obscured. The morning stretch and the 20 deep breaths were not preludes to the beauty routine. They were part of it. They were understood as operating on the face as directly as the cold cream, just through a different mechanism. That integration, that refusal to separate the body into compartments that are managed by different products and different experts and different spending categories, is something worth recovering. Not all of it. Some of it was coercive. Some of it asked women to perform a version of themselves that was exhausting and unfair. But the underlying idea that the body is one system and that you cannot tend one part of it without tending the rest is simply true. It was true in 1955 and it remains true now. We are nearly at the end of tonight's journey. One chapter remains, and it is the one I've saved for last, not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is in its own quiet way the most useful. We have spent hours in the past tonight rummaging through a cabinet full of jars and brushes and habits that belong to a very specific moment in time. The final question is the one worth leaving with after everything we have seen. What would it actually look like to bring the best of it forward, not as nostalgia, not as a wholesale rejection of the present, but as a thoughtful, intentional editing of what has quietly worked for a long time, applied to a life that looks very different from 1953. That is where we are headed, and we are almost there. Here is a number worth sitting with for a moment. The global skincare market was valued at approximately $532 billion in 2023. In that same year, the average American woman spent more than $300 annually on skincare products alone, not hair care, not makeup, just the products applied to the face and body before anything else happens in the morning. And a survey conducted across more than 2,000 women in the United Kingdom found that 62% of them had recently started skipping or cutting short their skincare routines, citing exhaustion, forgetfulness, or simply not having the time. $300 spent, 62% too tired to use what they bought. There is a very particular kind of irony in that combination, and I think it tells you something real about where we have arrived in our relationship with beauty. In 1955, a woman of modest means spent a fraction of that, a jar of cold cream, a bottle of witch hazel hand lotion by the kitchen sink, and she did not skip her routine. Not because she had more time, she absolutely did not. Not because the social pressure to look a certain way was gentler, it was considerably harsher. She did not skip it because the routine was simple enough to do automatically even at the end of an exhausting day. It required no willpower. It had no decision points. It was just what happened when she sat down at the mirror at the end of the evening, the same sequence, in the same order, a handful of affordable products she had used for years. That is the central argument I want to make in this final chapter, and it is simpler than it might sound. The 1950s beauty culture did not succeed because the products were better. In many respects, the products were less sophisticated than what we have access to today. It succeeded because the philosophy behind it was more durable, and that philosophy of consistency over complexity, of habit over effort, of knowing your skin and trusting what you've observed is not attached to any particular era. It is available to us right now if we choose it. Let me be specific about what I think is worth bringing forward. Not as a prescription, everyone's skin is different, everyone's life is different, and the idea of applying a single universal protocol to 7 billion unique bodies is itself part of the problem we're trying to move away from. But as a set of principles that were embedded in the daily practice of women in 1953, and that modern dermatology, biochemistry, and sleep science have since validated, even if it took 70 years to get there. The first is the double cleanse practiced as a daily ritual rather than an occasional treat. Oil-based removal, first a cold cream, a cleansing balm, whatever your skin responds well to, followed by a gentler water-based cleanse. This sequence is approximately 1900 years old. It is not a trend. It is chemistry applied twice every day without fail. The women of the 1950s did not name it. They also did not skip it. The second is the consistent application of a simple, effective emollient. Not a serum with 17 active ingredients that conflict with each other, not a routine so complicated that you cannot remember the order, just something that moisturizes reliably applied morning and night every day for years. The global beauty industry is approximately $532 billion in revenue. It has a vested interest in convincing you that you need more. Dermatologists, the ones without financial relationships to particular brands, consistently say otherwise. Consistency with a few things that work will always outperform excitement about many things that you rotate through. The third is the deliberate inclusion of rest in the beauty routine itself. The 1955 handbook prescribed a 10-minute rest in the evening, with cool cotton pads over the eyes. This was not indulgence. It was the deliberate insertion of stillness into a day that had no natural pauses. We have fewer natural pauses now than women in the 1950s did. We carry our offices in our pockets. We're available at every hour. The argument for building a 10-minute rest into the evening, even without the cotton pads, even without any particular purpose, has not weakened since 1955. It has only strengthened. The fourth is hand cream after washing. This one is so simple that listing it feels almost embarrassing. And yet, consider how many times you wash your hands on any given day, and how reliably you do not apply anything to them afterward, and how they look at the end of winter. The habit costs less than $1 a week. The woman in the kitchen of 1953 had it figured out. Now here is where I want to be honest about what not to bring forward, because this conversation only has integrity if it goes both directions. The 100-stroke hairbrush rule, practiced with a plastic brush over shampoo-stripped hair, does not need to come back. The specific technique was sound in its original context. The original context no longer exists for most people. The alkaline bar soap applied directly to the face recommended in some guides of the era has been replaced by better options. The pH matters. The modern equivalents are genuinely gentler. The beauty standard, white, young, thin, pale, does not need to come back. It needed to go. The work of dismantling it is ongoing and necessary, and nothing in the history we have explored tonight suggests otherwise. The expectation that a woman's appearance is a social obligation rather than a personal choice does not need to come back. The specific rituals can be reclaimed without reclaiming the coercion that originally surrounded them. You can make cold cream part of your nightly routine because it makes your skin feel good and gives you 5 quiet minutes at the mirror without any of the weight that the 1950s attached to those 5 minutes. The habit is separable from the obligation. Keeping the habit while refusing the obligation is, I think, a genuinely feminist act. Here is something that I find both fascinating and slightly maddening: skinimalism. The trend towards simpler, fewer product, more intentional skincare has been one of the dominant beauty movements of the early 2020s. A survey by Avon found that more than 2/3 of women globally were trimming their skincare routines, prioritizing what actually works over what is exciting. 81% of women over 35 said a simplified routine was more appealing than a complex one. The industry publication Beauty Independent noted in 2025 that skinimalism is no longer a trend, it's becoming a mindset. Skinimalism, as if it were a new idea. As if Constance Hart had not written a book in 1955 describing exactly this philosophy in considerably more practical detail than any Instagram caption has ever managed. I say this not to mock the trend, but to find it genuinely encouraging. The wheel is turning back towards something that was true before the wheel turned away from it. And maybe that is what cultural cycles do. They abandon what works in favor of what is exciting, accumulate complexity until it collapses under its own weight, and then slowly collectively remember what they already knew. The global beauty industry is $532 billion. It grew by creating complexity. It will not sell you simplicity unless it can rebrand simplicity as something new, something premium, something that requires a specific product to achieve. The woman in 1953 did not need to be told to simplify. She had 3 things on her shelf and used all of them daily without ever logging onto an app to track her routine. What I want to leave you with is not a list. Lists are the beauty industry's preferred format because they feel actionable and they sell products. What I want to leave you with is something harder to commodify. It is the image of a woman at a small mirror in the particular light of early evening. She has a jar of cold cream and a bottle of something astringent and a tube of hand lotion by the sink, and she goes through her routine in the same order she always does, without haste and without particular excitement. And when she is done, she stands there for a moment and looks at her own face in the quiet. She knows her skin. She's been paying attention to it for years. She knows what makes it feel tight and what makes it feel supple. She knows that the steam bath twice a week makes a difference she can see, and that skipping hand cream makes a difference she can feel. This knowledge is hers. She earned it through observation and consistency, not through the advice of an algorithm or the endorsement of an influencer, or the anxiety of wondering whether she's doing it correctly. That knowledge, practical, personal, earned, is the thing I think we have most thoroughly lost and the thing most worth recovering. Not any particular product, not any particular ritual, the attention itself. The patient repeated unhurried attention to your own skin, your own body, your own rhythms applied over time without perfectionism, without crisis, without the constant background noise of a beauty industry telling you that what you already have is inadequate. The women of 1953 were not doing this perfectly. They were doing it within a cultural moment that imposed enormous costs alongside the wisdom it preserved. But the wisdom was real. Some of it has held for nearly 2,000 years, and some of it, the double cleanse, the emollient, the hand cream, the rest, the stretch at the window in the morning will probably still be true 2,000 years from now. Because the chemistry of skin has not changed. The biology of sleep has not changed. The lymphatic system has not changed. What changes is what we are told to believe about these things, and how much we are asked to pay to address them. The most radical beauty practice available to you is simpler than anything in a serum. It is knowing your own face well enough to trust what you observe. It is returning to the same small rituals night after night with patience and without drama. It is understanding that beauty in the deepest sense is not a project with a finish line. It is a practice. It was always a practice. The women at their oval mirrors, the ones who taught their daughters, and whose daughters taught theirs, knew that long before the industry existed to tell them otherwise. We are nearly at the end of tonight's story. One final chapter remains the goodbye, the payoff, the last thing I want to say before the light goes out. And it is perhaps the most important thing of all, because we have spent several hours in the past, but we live in the present, and the question of how to carry everything we have seen into an actual contemporary life is the one that matters most. That is exactly where we're going next, and we are almost there. Let me tell you about a woman named Dorothy. She was not famous. She did not appear in any beauty advertisements. She did not write a handbook or a magazine column or leave behind anything that historians would consider a primary source. She was an ordinary woman living in an ordinary house in Cincinnati, Ohio in the 1950s, and I know about her because her granddaughter wrote about her in a letter that was shared in a women's magazine in 1998, 40 years after the era we've been exploring tonight. The letter described Dorothy's bathroom shelf with the precision of someone who had stood beside it as a child and absorbed every detail without knowing why. The cold cream in a white jar with a blue lid, the witch hazel in its plain brown bottle, the hand lotion by the sink so thoroughly used that the pump had been replaced twice, a small glass dish that held nothing but a cake of soap and a folded washcloth. And on the inside of the cabinet door, this is the detail I cannot stop thinking about, a handwritten card in Dorothy's own script that listed in her careful cursive the 7 steps of her evening routine. Step 1, Step 2, all the way to 7, every night the same 7 steps in the same order. The card had been there so long that the ink had faded to the colour of old tea. Dorothy's granddaughter wrote that she had inherited nothing of material value when Dorothy passed, but she'd memorised those 7 steps before she was 12 years old. She still followed them every night 40 years later. She'd been doing it so long she no longer needed to count. That is what we've been talking about all this time. Not products, not a specific brand of cold cream or a particular technique for cuticle care. The card on the inside of the cabinet door. The habit encoded so thoroughly into the texture of daily life that it outlives. The person who first practiced it travels across decades and arrives in the bathroom of someone who has no idea why she does what she does, only that she has always done it, and that it feels like home. We have travelled a long way tonight. Through ancient Rome and Ottoman hammams, through the chemistry of beeswax and the biology of sleep, through the warmth of a steam bath in a 1952 kitchen, and the complicated weight of a tube of red lipstick. We've been honest about what worked and what caused harm. We've followed the science where it confirmed the wisdom and noted where it complicated it. And we have arrived here at the end with something that I hope feels less like information and more like a compass. Let me try to name what I think that compass is pointing toward. The women of the 1950s were operating inside a cultural moment that was in significant ways unfair to them. The expectations were too narrow, the standards were too exclusive. The obligation to maintain an appearance was too heavy and too unequally distributed. None of that is in dispute, and none of it should be romanticized. But inside that moment, many of them built something real. They built a practice of attending to themselves daily, consistently, without drama, without the expectation that any single product would change everything, or that any single day's routine would produce visible results. They built it into the architecture of the morning and the evening so thoroughly that it did not require motivation. It was simply what the day looked like from beginning to end. And that practice, stripped of its cultural constraints, detached from the specific historical pressures that surrounded it, relocated into a contemporary life with different demands and different freedoms, is still available. It has always been available. The tools are modest. The time required is small. The results compounded over years are measurable. And the byproduct 5 minutes of quiet at the mirror at the end of the day, your own unhurried attention turned toward your own face, is something that no amount of money can purchase, and that no algorithm can replicate. I want to take a moment here in the quiet near the end to notice something about where you are right now. You're in a bed or on a couch or in some comfortable position with low light, and probably something soft within reach. You're listening to a story about people who have been dead for 70 years, doing things with their bathroom cabinets that on the surface have very little to do with your life. And somehow this has kept your attention for several hours. I find that genuinely moving. Not because I take credit for it. You brought yourself here, you chose this particular hour of stories over everything else the internet was offering you tonight. But because it suggests something about what we actually want underneath the noise. We want to slow down. We want to hear things that are worth the time they take. We want to understand the world we live in as something that was made gradually by people who were trying their best with what they had, and we want perhaps to feel a little less alone in that effort ourselves. The women at their vanity tables in 1953 were trying their best with what they had. Some of what they had was genuinely good. Some of it was genuinely harmful. They lived in a world that asked too much of them and explained too little, and they navigated it with the practical ingenuity that people have always brought to the constraints they cannot immediately change. They used cold cream and boar bristle brushes and witch hazel, and a bowl of hot water and a jar of petroleum jelly that cost 25 cents. They stood at windows and breathed in the morning. They checked their posture in the mirror and pushed back their cuticles and applied hand cream more times a day than they consciously thought about. They slept in cool, dark rooms and left emollient on their faces overnight, and some of them kept a card on the inside of the cabinet door with 7 steps written in careful cursive. They were not perfect. They were not idealized. They were people managing a life doing their best. And in the doing of their best, they preserved something that the beauty industry of the following decades worked very hard to convince us we needed to replace with something more complex, more expensive, more dependent on external expertise and less on personal observation. Something that our own era finally exhaustedly, after years of 10-step routines and ingredient anxiety and the peculiar madness of beauty hall culture, is slowly, quietly beginning to remember. Consistency, simplicity, the patient accumulation of small acts performed without heroism day after day for a long time. Here is what I would offer you to carry from tonight's story into whatever comes next. Choose 3 things. Just 3: a cleanser that feels right, a moisturizer that your skin has responded well to something for your hands. Use them every day, not some days, every day. Put them somewhere you will see them. Build the habit into a sequence you do not have to think about. Give it 3 months, not 3 days. Pay attention to what you observe, not to what an advertisement tells you to want. Stand at a window in the morning sometime and breathe. Not with headphones in, not while checking something. Just stand there with both feet on the floor and take 10 slow breaths, and let the morning have a moment of your full attention before the day begins its particular form of noise. Go to bed at a reasonable hour in a room that is cool and dark. This is the most powerful beauty product that has ever existed, and it costs nothing, and the beauty industry cannot sell it to you, which is why it is not mentioned in advertisements. Notice your hands. Take 15 seconds for them when you wash them. That is all. That is the whole inheritance. It is not glamorous. It will not go viral. Nobody is going to film a transformation video after 3 weeks of moisturizer and adequate sleep. But 3 years from now, if you do these things consistently, you will know something about your own skin that you do not know today. And that knowledge, personal, earned unhurried, is worth considerably more than any product that promises to give it to you immediately. Dorothy's granddaughter ended her letter with something that I have been thinking about ever since I came across it. She wrote that she used to find the 7 steps fussy. She used to think of them when she was a teenager as something old-fashioned that her grandmother clung to out of habit, or out of the particular stubbornness of the old. It was only later, much later, she wrote somewhere in her own middle age, standing at her own mirror at the end of her own long day, that she understood what the card on the inside of the cabinet door actually was. It was not a routine, it was a structure. It was 7 small acts of self-return performed every evening that made the end of the day feel like the end of the day, not like another task, not like an obligation, like a threshold crossed in a particular order at a particular pace until the body understood that the day was finished and the night could begin. We're all looking for that threshold, I think. Not everyone finds it in a bathroom cabinet. Not everyone has a grandmother who wrote 7 steps in fading cursive and stuck them to the inside of a door. But the thing they were pointing toward, the deliberate, repeated personal act of returning to yourself at the end of the day, in the same small way, in the same quiet, is something that does not require a particular era or a particular set of products. It just requires the decision to come back, night after night, to the mirror, to the moment, to yourself. And on that thought, on the image of a woman at a mirror in the light that comes just before the light goes out, I want to leave you here in the comfortable dark where stories settle into something you carry rather than something you just heard. You came tonight looking for something, maybe history, maybe beauty tips, maybe just a voice to carry you into sleep. I hope you found something worth the hours you gave it. What we explored here was never really about the cream in the jar. It was about the philosophy behind the jar, the idea that caring for yourself is not a luxury, not an indulgence, not a project with a finish line. It is a practice. An ongoing imperfect daily practice that compounds quietly over time, requiring nothing more glamorous than showing up. That idea was true in ancient Rome when a physician named Galen stirred beeswax and rose water together for the first time. It was true in the 1950s when ordinary women stood at ordinary mirrors and did their ordinary beautiful routines. It is true right now wherever you are in whatever light you're listening by. It will still be true when we do not exist to say it. Take care of yourself tonight. Take care of yourself tomorrow and the day after in the same small ways without expecting anything dramatic in return. The women who built these habits into the fabric of daily life did not do it for results you could measure in a week. They did it because consistency over time is its own kind of grace, and maybe that is the oldest beauty secret of all. Thank you truly genuinely for spending these hours with me. If this story gave you something worth keeping, I would love to know. Drop it in the comments, whatever it is, a habit you want to try, something that surprised you, a memory it brought back. I read everything, and those notes mean more than you might think. If you found yourself here tonight and you have not yet subscribed, this is the moment. There are more stories waiting, some of them even older than tonight, some stranger. All of them true. I will be here with the lights kept soft, the same unhurried pace. Another evening of things worth knowing before the world goes quiet. Rest well. You deserve the sleep. The next story is already waiting for you.